Please be seated.
Government bills and orders for second reading. Bill 73, Infrastructure Accountability Act. Adjourned debate. Ms. Phillips.
Honourable members, before the Assembly, Bill 73 for second reading, the Infrastructure Accountability Act. Are there others wishing to join in the debate? The Honourable Member for Calgary-McCall has risen.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My pleasure to rise and speak to Infrastructure Accountability Act. The name of the bill suggests that it has something to do with accountability, but what we have seen so far and what we saw this afternoon, where our government can duck accountability, they will do that. And looking at this bill, it's a brief bill which sets out some criteria that need to be used by ministers while submitting their capital plans and priorities. And the things that are listed there, I think on this side of the House, there are 2-3 colleagues who have been in cabinet, and they will agree with me that that's how this capital submission process works. As minister in charge of your file, you work with your stakeholders, you work with your department, you identify the priorities, you prioritize those priorities, and you submit it to the minister, and you make sure that they align with the program and services that you are responsible for. They align with the business plan of your department. They align with business plan and priorities of your government. There is no other way of making these submissions. And then if there is something that relates to your constituency, then I guess you identify those priorities, make a case and submit it to your Minister of Infrastructure, and then those priorities are reviewed by Minister, by public service, and funding is allocated. There is nothing really new in Section 2 that ministers that have not been doing. At least that was the case when we were in government. However, I think when UCP was in government, since the UCP is in government, there were major capital investments that did not follow anything listed here. And by reading this bill, I'm not sure even this criteria will be followed in those kind of investments. I think it will be helpful if Minister of Infrastructure can rise in this House and tell us how this bill will apply, for instance, to Keystone XL investment that government did a couple of years ago now. Essentially, they didn't follow any criteria whatsoever. They were simply betting on President Trump getting reelected for the White House. That was the only way that project could have moved forward. And that resulted in jacking up our debt burden on taxpayer, wasting our taxpayer money, And now I can't see anything in this bill that will help Albertan money, protect Albertan money in the future. And Section 3 says, the responsible minister shall establish and communicate process for the preparation and submission of capital planning submission by minister. I think there is already a process, and there always have been a process that you identify the priorities. Those priorities relate to your program and services, relate to your government's overall objectives. That's how infrastructure priorities were identified, except what UCP did in case of investment in Keystone XL, in case of investment in Red Water Refinery. They never shared anything with respect to those projects. I remember on the side of the house that for months we asked about the details of those deals, that deal. We asked about how that money was spent. Was the risk that Albertans are exposed to? And the government never shared anything about that deal, about that infrastructure investment. We asked for their risk analysis, how that decision was made. They refused to share anything. And now government is putting forward a bill, I think for most part, so that Minister of Infrastructure can have a bill in his name, but it doesn't change anything. It doesn't assure us that going forward, if this government was to make another investment like Keystone itself, that they will be sharing those details with Albertans. And there are some other things as well, criteria for capital planning submission, and there are a few criteria listed there. Essentially, all these things are included in those submissions in cabinet report, that why certain infrastructure project is getting money while others are put on waiting list, and the necessary, I guess, element of those submission is that what economic value they add, what social value they add, what kind of jobs they create, and all those things. But now they have included something here, protecting community members and assets from natural disaster. So that caught my eye, that on June 13th, 2020, there was a natural disaster in northeast Calgary. I think many MLAs from Calgary Northeast, Calgary Falcon Ridge, even Calgary Cross will know. It was the fourth largest natural disaster in Canadian history. In the middle of the pandemic, when people don't have jobs, they were going through a global pandemic. And we didn't see any kind of help, any protection for the community members or their assets. Their personal property was damaged, their vehicles were damaged, their homes were damaged. And Mr. Speaker, if you drive through those neighborhoods, you will still see, after more than a year, You will still see homes that have not been repaired yet. You will still see homes with boarded up windows. And in that quadrant, you will still see vehicles that are dented and damaged with that hailstorm. We didn't see any infrastructure support flowing to Northeast Calgary from this government. Now they're putting it in this piece of legislation that they will prioritize protecting community members and assets from natural disaster. I think it will be helpful if the Minister would explain how that will work for my constituents in Calgary-McCall, and generally Northeast Calgary. So in short, I would say that increased transparency around infrastructure planning and spending is always welcome, but can't be expected from this government. And this bill has some glaring omissions which must be addressed and fixed. Because as I said before, this is a government that spent $1.3 billion on Donald Trump getting reelected and still refuses to release all the details of that deal. So if we're putting forward a bill that is titled Infrastructure Accountability Act, then Albertans should be able to account for the money that's wasted by this government. This bill doesn't give us the tools to get that kind of accountability from this government. And I think other criteria that government listed here there is no way for a layperson, for a lay Albertan to see that's the process government followed. That's how they identified. It's still an internal process. And for all these reasons, I think this bill is very short on details. Like many other government bills, it just adds accountability to the title, but it doesn't bring any accountability whatsoever. In the books of history, it just puts one piece of legislation in the name of infrastructure minister. That's all. And if government is serious about accountability going forward in infrastructure projects, then government should work with us, work with stakeholders, work with Albertans, consult with experts in public finance and accounting, and try to improve this piece of legislation. Because so far this government record has been that of secrecy, and they've been even getting awards from across the country. That's so far as their record. And by putting word on a piece of paper, accountability doesn't change anything. That's what we saw this afternoon when we were asking this government to hold Premier accountable for his failure during COVID-19. They didn't. So with that, I move a referral amendment that will refer this bill to Alberta's economic future committee for further consideration.
Thank you, Honorable Member. We'll just have the pages come grab it. Once I have a copy, you'll have 30 seconds remaining. Should you provide any other additional comments? Honorable members, this will be referred to as Amendment REF1.
In short, Mr. Speaker, for all the reasons I provided earlier, this bill is very vague, short on details, and does nothing to provide accountability for infrastructure projects. I think it's in the best interest of all Albertans that we send this to committee and discuss this further. Thank you.
Honorable members, on referral amendment REF1, is there anyone wishing to speak? I see the honorable member for Calgary East has risen.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I oppose this amendment for many reasons, and I support this bill, and I want to begin expressing my support for this bill 73. I would like to highlight my appreciation to all frontline workers, communities, families, and all Albertans that have been patiently working to help reduce the spread of COVID-19, which is affecting all segments of the world. The aim is to always raise awareness and slow the spread. The Alberta government is continuously working firmly on providing COVID-19 updates to ensure our province, family, children, and working Albertans are safe. For that, I express my appreciation to the healthcare professionals for all the dedication and for taking the initiative and spending countless hours working hard during this time of health crisis. And I would like to applaud the Minister for consulting with the McKinnon panel in advising a legislation that would provide a strong government framework for capital planning and formalizing the role of the Deputy Minister's Capital Committee. Mr. Speaker, I would also like to extend my appreciation to the major stakeholders such as the Calgary Economic Development, Capital Power, University of Calgary, that participated in the summer 2020 engagement to propose criteria for the Act, as well as to 3,172 survey submissions and 56 written submissions, including input from the following sectors: energy, healthcare, schools, municipalities, constructions, post-secondary community and recreation, transportation, technology, agriculture, public safety, finance, and the indigenous communities. The result of this survey identified many key benefits to implement the Act, with providing more accountability, more transparency, less political bias, and better informed project proposals. Many members of the municipal governments as well provided input through the survey conducted in summer 2020. Self-reported municipal sector representation accounted for 11% of respondents, the third most represented sector after the community and the school sectors. Many written submissions from municipal organizations who voiced support for the Act, and its objective includes the Rural Municipalities of Alberta, RMA, Alberta Urban Municipalities Association, AUMA, City of Calgary, and City of Edmonton. It was amazing to see that many of the respondents expressed support of the Act, including the 6 prioritization criteria, the governance framework, and the need for the long-term capital planning. Mr. Speaker, in Alberta, infrastructure sector provides innovative, high-quality, well-designed public structures for Albertans. Through leadership, expertise, and collaboration with partners, the ministry provides public infrastructure that contributes to the province's economy and quality of life. The ministry is accountable for the long-term planning of the provincial public infrastructure to support key social programs, services, and economic development. Infrastructure sector in Alberta designs, builds, manages, maintains government-owned and operated facilities while collaborating with other ministries to ensure that school and health infrastructure meets the needs of all Albertans now and in the future. Infrastructure is important for faster economic growth and alleviation of challenges that is faced within the province. This sufficient infrastructure in the form of road, railway, transport system, ports, power, airports, and the efficient working is also needed for efficient operations. In addition, infrastructure provides accommodation, services, and manages a large portfolio of owned and leased facilities while maintaining fiscal accountability and optimizing value for taxpayers. The last couple of years has been most challenging, but with the support of the government investment, the resilience of Albertans, and a will to rebound and serve the foundation of Alberta's recovery. Mr. Speaker, I would like to remind everyone that the government has been investing in healthcare capital budget 2021 with a commitment of $3.4 billion over the next 3 years for health-related capital projects and programs, providing $2.2 billion for which will be committed to health facilities with $141 million for 5 new projects, as well $776 million for Alberta Health Services self-finance capitals for parkades, equipment, and other capital requirements. $343 million for capital maintenance and renewal of existing facilities, and $90 million for health department IT projects. Overall, Mr. Speaker, the 2021 capital plan will invest approximately $21 billion to build new roads, schools, hospitals over the next 3 years. As of the first quarter fiscal update, funding in 2021-22 has increased by over $2 billion from budget 2020. The additional funding will support infrastructure projects carefully identified for their potential to support long-term economic growth with a plan to support more than 50,000 direct and 40,000 indirect jobs. Mr. Speaker, for example, over the past couple of years, there has been a tremendous amount of work that has been committed to ensure long-term job opportunities are created. Such projects in Alberta include the Calgary Cancer Center, which is creating approximately 21,000 jobs by 2022. Throughout Alberta's history, the creation of infrastructure in the province has been an inspiring partnership between the various sectors representing who Albertans really are. The coming of the railroads in the late 19th century led to large-scale movement of farmers and cattlemen from Eastern Canada, the United States, and Europe. It was a great opportunity for economic development. Infrastructure makes up our road, transit, and water systems, schools, as well as our parks and waste facilities, to name just a few. Mr. Speaker, before 2019, the government of Alberta had informal criteria that was outlined in an internal capital planning manual, which was a longer list of criteria. Compared to the criteria developed for the Act, the criteria used by the previous government was less focused on economic impacts and did not include elements such as return on investments, life cycle, cost, or resiliency. The criteria are no different from what has been used in the last 3 budgets. Legislating and publicly communicating the prioritization criteria adds transparency around the capital planning process, which stakeholders and Albertans identified as being of great importance during engagement in the summer of 2020. Mr. Speaker, Bill 73 will fulfill platform commitments to provide a transparency around the process of capital planning, and importantly, will aid in the Alberta's recovery plan by supporting jobs and expanding the economy. The Infrastructure Accountability Act will help the Government of Alberta in making important capital project investment decisions that will provide Albertans with needed projects. The Act will increase transparency for stakeholders and will allow the Treasury boards and Cabinet to engage and ensure strategies around capital plan match our financial realities of today. The Act demonstrates government's commitment for being transparent, accountable, unbiased when making capital plan decisions. The 6 criteria in the Infrastructure Accountability Act will evaluate how our capital project will address health, safety, and compliance needs, alignment with the government priorities and strategies, foster economic activity, create jobs, improve program delivery and services, and consider life cycle cost, whether return on investment is generated as well, will ensure if communities enhancement. Mr. Speaker, to specify the 6 criteria in the Act which have been developed with input from the Treasury Board, cross-ministry engagement, cross-jurisdictional research and stakeholder consultation, have strong support for the proposed 6 criteria. These 6 criteria have been used successfully during the development of Budget 2019, Budget 2020, and Budget 2021. Projects are expected to decrease the risk to the health and safety of Albertans. The strategic alignment should extend projects or program aligns with the government's strategic objectives. The economic impact are expected to result in positive economic impacts, including direct or indirect job creation and economic development and activity. Program delivery and services is expected to result in the improved delivery of programs and services. The life cycle cost and return on investments are considered to evaluate whether the project or program will generate a return on investment. And other jurisdictions in Canada, such as Ontario and Quebec, have similar legislation. Ontario has legislated criteria, and both Ontario and Quebec have legislated the development and review of long-term infrastructure plans. Like Alberta, Ontario, and Quebec's legislation focuses on long-term evidence-based planning and the need for government accountability and transparency. British Columbia and Manitoba do have legislation specific to infrastructure. However, the focus is strictly on transportation. Within 1 year of the Act coming into force, a 20-year strategic capital plan must be published, which will help with forward planning of all types of public infrastructure. Prudent, purposeful, long-term planning is particularly critical with infrastructure, as the effects of these decisions remain for decades to come. The 20-year strategic capital plan will guide the long-term planning for Alberta's infrastructure and promote greater transparency by providing strategic direction beyond the annual capital plan in the budget. This will help inform capital plan decision-making and keep a long-term lenses on infrastructure decisions with long-term cost. This is a platform commitment and recommendation of the McKinnon panel, ensuring that long-term strategic capital planning is the best practice. Jurisdictions both within Canada and international. And Mr. Speaker, the Infrastructure Accountability Act reflects input collected from Albertans through survey and written submissions from various sectors across Alberta. As many respondents expressed support of the Act, I as well encourage all the members of this chamber to support the 6 prioritization criteria, the governance framework, and the need for the long-term capital planning that is being introduced by Bill 73, the Infrastructure Accountability Act. Mr. Speaker, the collaboration with partners such as ministries, boards, agencies, industries, and other stakeholders will create jobs and bolster Alberta's economic recovery. And again, I will applaud the Minister, all the stakeholders and Albertans that have taken the time to provide feedback to not only better the economy of Alberta, but to respect and support the feedback of all our workers and employees. And once again, I oppose this amendment, and thank you, Mr. Speaker.
On Amendment REF1, are there others? The Honourable Member for Edmonton West Henday has risen.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's an honor to rise this evening. And, I was going to stand up and mention that I wasn't sure where the previous member speaking was going to go with that. I think the member got cut off right as they were stating that they won't be supporting the amendment. That's unfortunate. I was waiting for that. I thought it might be a cliffhanger. But I do appreciate those comments, and I think there was some leeway given there, and so hopefully I would be provided the same amount. But Mr. Speaker, when we look at what we're seeing within this piece of legislation, Bill 73, and why I believe it should go back to committee, that the referral amendment should be accepted, has been discussed already by some of the members on this side of the House, but just quickly looking at, even within the preamble, we see, whereas the Government of Alberta is committed to fostering transparency, predictability, and accountability in capital planning processes. Okay, that sounds reasonable and agreeable. We look further, whereas the Government of Alberta is committed to infrastructure planning that is long-term, priority-based, and strategic. I mean, again, within the preamble, I think that you could find that many members, including myself on this side of the legislature, could support those initiatives in that preamble. But unfortunately, we see again and again, Mr. Speaker, that whether within this legislation or within the lack of what's in this legislation, there are concerns when it comes to predictability, when it comes to transparency, when it comes to accountability. And I think that you could look no further than at the KXL decision. The fact is, an investment decision like the one that was made under the Keystone XL pipeline would not be accountable under this legislation. Of course, it wasn't considered a capital project, so it's not affected by this. And just in this one instance, we can see why there is going to be concerns in terms of accountability from this government, whether it's written in this instance in legislation or not. Again, you could look to the war room that this government has set up, spending money to create reports that at the end of the day, the government can say what they want about it, but I don't think that the findings of it have been conclusive by any means. And it's unfortunate that Alberta taxpayer dollars are footing the bill for this. But again, when we look back on the idea of accountability and transparency and why this needs to be referred to committee, the fact is there's been too many decisions that have been made by this government that contradict, that go against the preamble that is even written in this legislation. The idea that we see within this legislation about a 20-year capital plan, I have thoughts on that, but at the end of the day, this is quite an extensive plan that this government is proposing. I'm interested to see how they see that coming together. But the fact is, within this legislation itself, the government is expressly saying that cost sharing isn't even worth considering. And so when we're talking about a 20-year capital plan, these are important conversations that we have to have with municipalities, big and small across the province, that we have to have with conversations with the federal government. And unfortunately, we don't see that commitment within this legislation. And so again, we have a bill before us, Bill 73, the Infrastructure Accountability Act, that I again will be hoping we can see support to refer this to committee, because at the end of the day, Mr. Speaker, there is a lot of holes in this legislation, not only when it comes to nothing involving commitments from all levels of governments, or how we're going to share those capital projects and the costs of them. We don't see a commitment to supporting Indigenous communities or ensuring that First Nations, Métis, Inuit are at the table for these conversations. And these are criticisms, I think, that continue to happen against this government, that they aren't willing to have real consultations on these important pieces of legislation. And that is why, again, I will be supporting the amendment put forward by the member from Calgary, McCall, to move this to committee. We see in this legislation a commitment to a 20-year capital plan, but it wasn't long ago, Mr. Speaker, that this government made the decision to go back against their word, something that should be taken very seriously, Mr. Speaker, as the governing party in this province, as the party that has the current premier of the province. The word of the premier, the word of the government, whether in cabinet or a private member, they should be accountable to what they're saying. And so again, I've raised this point before, Mr. Speaker, that our government, when we were government through 2015 to 2019, we made commitments. We went through a rigorous consultation process with our major municipalities, with our big cities, and we came up with a framework around MSI that would ensure that funding is predictable for them, so that they can ensure that whether they're considering their tax base, or whether they're talking about property taxes or emergency funding, whether it might, or whatever it might be, that they have that predictability. And at that time, Mr. Speaker, again, this current government, when in opposition, supported those changes that we were proposing. Yet a short while after the election happened, and again, this was in their campaign platform, they went back on that word. They couldn't even stay committed to their own word for a year, yet they're expecting us to believe that we can trust their 20-year capital plan, Mr. Speaker. It's hard to believe, and that's why I do support the referral on the floor, the amendment to Bill 73, the Infrastructure Accountability Act, because I think that this government needs to go back to the drawing board. I think that we need to hear from our municipal counterparts, from our school board counterparts, from our Indigenous communities, and other organizations that are going to be affected by this legislation, to hear if they truly believe that their views are represented through this bill. Now, when we look at, Mr. Speaker, some other things that are within this legislation, the idea that the full life cycle cost of a project or program, whether the project or program will generate a return on investment, is an interesting and important proposal, I imagine. Depending on what it is, of course, Mr. Speaker, we don't necessarily expect a K-12 school to necessarily return investment, well, other than the fact that we're raising the next generation of students, of course, Mr. Speaker. But the fact is, these are, within this legislation, important things that we should be considering. But again, there are things missing that are so important to ensure that we are getting value for our infrastructure, that there is accountability from this government or the next government, whoever it might be. And further to that, within this legislation, we see the idea that the full life cycle cost is considered. And I have to say that I'm worried, Mr. Speaker. We've heard several ministers on that side of the House.
Honourable members, if you'd like to have private conversations, there's lots of places to do that, or at the very least keep them to a level where I can't at least hear them, and show some courtesy to the member speaking, the Honourable Member for Edmonton West Henday.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The idea of ensuring that we recognize the full life cycle cost of a project seems to elude this government. You know, it might be written in this legislation, Bill 73, but the fact is we've seen several ministers on that side of the House continue to support the idea of P3s and even consider and are in the process of moving P3s forward in our education system, in our potentially our seniors ministry or within housing. And these continue to be concerns, Mr. Speaker, because the fact is we've seen Auditor Generals across the province across Canada that have come back after these projects are finished and determined that governments would have actually saved millions and millions of dollars if they had just made those investments themselves. And Mr. Speaker, you may have or may not have heard stories of the concerns that come from school boards and from schools after the fact of these P3 schools being built, because they so often have issues getting a hold of those companies or corporations that were built in partnership with those school boards to actually handle things like broken boilers or whatever it might be, Mr. Speaker. And so, again, I'm not sure that the direction and the decisions of this government are actually supported by their own legislation that they're trying to move forward on. We've heard members on this side of the House, specifically members that were previously ministers, talk about the fact that the pieces that are within Bill 73, most of them in terms of the process of accountability for how we plan infrastructure into the future, that these are already things that are considered and that are happening. And if anything, Bill 73 is actually going backwards in terms of the criteria that is considered when those projects are being communicated, when they're being planned, and when they move forward. And so I would be very interested to hear what the public has to say about this legislation. That's okay at this time. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd be interested to hear what the public has to say about this. I think that from what we've heard, that they are concerned that there isn't a piece around collaboration about ensuring that those partnerships are being considered, especially when it comes to this idea of a 20-year capital plan. That we're talking about billions and billions of dollars and projects that are going to set up the province and our municipalities for the future, yet we aren't even willing to consider through Bill 73, the Infrastructure Accountability Act, the opportunities for partnership between all levels of government. And Mr. Speaker, I really think it goes back to the fact that this government and this premier seem to believe that they know best. They seem to believe that decisions that are made by different levels of government are getting in their way, even on issues that are of great importance to the people of our province, whether we're talking about childcare, whether we're talking about ensuring pandemic dollars are flowing to Albertans, whether small business or workers themselves. These are decisions that have been delayed on and on by this government because they're unwilling to give any credit to anyone that isn't themselves when it comes to ensuring that people are safe and that projects are getting completed and on, Mr. Speaker. So there's a lot of concern here. The fact that, again, this government is willing to go back on the decisions around city charters, the fact that this government continues down a path of P3s that in many cases don't get accounted for in that budget cycle and put off that debt accounting onto future years and future governments. And even today, Mr. Speaker, we saw in this House the UCP using procedural trickery to ensure that legislation that we're putting forward to hold this government accountable isn't even considered, putting it to the bottom of the order paper. And this continues to go back to the fact, Mr. Speaker, that this government would do anything in its power to ensure that they are not held accountable. And so I'm not convinced that even with Bill 73, the Infrastructure Accountability Act, going through the process, if it were to be passed, that they would even be willing to follow through with the commitments that they've made within that legislation. It's hard to believe, Mr. Speaker. And so again, when we look at the considerations around the failed gamble on the Keystone XL, the failed gamble on the $4.7 billion corporate handout, which we've heard time and time again that the largest, most well-off corporations are using that for stock buybacks, to move their facilities and their companies that they have here into other jurisdictions. The list is long, Mr. Speaker, of mistakes that this government has made. And unfortunately, it's Albertans at the end of the day that lose. But I hope that we can continue to have discussions around Bill 73, that it will be referred to committee, that we'll have an opportunity to bring in stakeholders, both private citizens, nonprofits, municipal organizations, municipal governments, and Indigenous groups. I mean, the list is long of people that are going to be affected by such a piece of legislation, and it's deeply important that we get that right, Mr. Speaker. So with that, I look forward to hearing some more comments from my colleagues. At this time, I will be supporting the referral to committee. I hope that all members of the Assembly will be. And with that, I think, since I don't see any interjections at this point, I'm going to take my seat. Thank you.
Honourable members, on Amendment REF1, are there others? The Honourable Member for Red Deer South.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, I'll stand and speak against the amendment. No surprise there. But I'm actually really excited about this act. One of the reasons I ran to serve as an MLA is I really have a strong desire to see more accountability in government and a better culture, a culture towards excellence. So I would like to give for the members a real-life example of where I think this act can be of great value. And I'd like to talk about AHS and how they carry on with their infrastructure projects. And in the constituency in which I serve, the Red Deer Regional Hospital is in my constituency. And this hospital serves a catchment population of more than 300,000 Albertans. And in addition to Red Deer, the hospital serves the residents of surrounding communities in central Alberta for medical emergencies. So while there are some small hospitals in central Alberta, Albertans in central Alberta depend on the hospital to meet their emergency health needs. So what happened in terms of infrastructure and the hospital is over a period of a number of years, including the Redford PC government, under the NDP government, unfortunately, there has been growing overcrowding issues at the hospital, more profound than any other areas in the province. But more important than that, Mr. Speaker, is that there have been resulting poor health outcomes for Albertans living in central Alberta due to a lack of infrastructure investment. And this issue has become so profound that concerned members in our community started a demand care website. And in fact, there is now a society that is advocating for equitable infrastructure investment in healthcare in central Alberta. But I want to talk about what a lack of accountability resulted in. So when the NDP came into power, in 2016, the NDP dropped the hospital from the provincial infrastructure priority list. And the citizens, the families and individuals in Red Deer, were really concerned. There was public outrage. And I think the NDP government heard about that. And the NDP later on did put the hospital back on the list. But Mr. Speaker, they didn't do anything. Yes, they removed it in 2016 from the list. Then the public had to get upset. And with that public outcry, the NDP put it back on the list. But Mr. Speaker, they didn't do anything. They did nothing. Well, it's actually true. So in 2017, in response to systematic government neglect, a group of citizens formed the Society for Hospital Expansion in Central Alberta. And this occurred in 2017 under the NDP in absence of an Infrastructure Accountability Act. So the Society, Mr. Speaker, actually has a website called Demand Care, www.demandcare.ca. And I invite all members in the legislature to visit the Demand Care website, because what it illustrates is what happens when there is a lack of accountability in infrastructure. When governments act for political purposes and don't use objective criteria based on merit and need when evaluating infrastructure needs. So the Society states that data obtained from AHS indicates that during a 10-year period, Calgary received $2.5 billion, Edmonton $1.4 billion, and Central Alberta $107 million for healthcare infrastructure, or $228 per person for Central Alberta, significantly the lowest of any area of the province, where there is an average per person of $2,300, tenfold of what was in Central Alberta. Now, Mr. Speaker, I appreciate that we will never be perfect in terms of per capita comparisons. I understand that. And I understand, too, that, of course, in some larger centers, in, for example, Calgary and Edmonton, just based on a population base, they will have some specialized services available that, from an economies of scale perspective, it's just not feasible to have everywhere. But having said that, Mr. Speaker, unprincipled governments, when they use vote bribing, that does not prioritize fairness. It lacks accountability, and the numbers speak for themselves. And the NDP, Mr. Speaker, failed on that. So speaking with members of the medical community involved in the Society, part of the issue is an AHS structure which denies local representation in capital decision-making. Decision-making for the Central region resides with AHS officials in Edmonton and Calgary, with a feeling in Central Alberta that some decisions have been less on principle, with a focus on public health outcomes, and more on calculated vote buying, with a focus on political outcomes. Mr. Speaker, with materially higher risk of adverse outcomes in the event of, for example, heart attacks, Central Albertans, For example, for many years, we're asking for a cardiac cath lab at the hospital, which the NDP, yes, I'm happy for an intervention.
Thank you to the member from Red Deer South, and I think he was getting to the point maybe that I was going to ask about. I know he's a passionate advocate for his community, especially when it comes to the cath lab. Could the member talk a bit about what it means, not just in dollars and cents, which is important to understand at a policy level, but in terms of individual lack of access and lives that are affected because of a lack of accountability in terms of infrastructure, and how it affects your constituents and those in central Alberta, where it serves in a catchment area of, I believe, a couple 100,000, because you do not have those services? Are there individual instances you know of people that have been affected negatively because of the way that previous governments have neglected your community?
Thank you for that question, member. I actually do. One of our elected city council officials in this recent election actually had a close relative die because there was a lack of cath lab services. And that is a really important observation. The most important part when we kind of talk about infrastructure is how do we improve health outcomes for Central Albertans? Governments need, in terms of a health system, to put individuals at the heart of the healthcare system. When we have infrastructure decisions that are not based on merit and need, we subordinate the personal important needs of individuals, and we do a disservice to the public interest. Mr. Speaker, I know the heart of the infrastructure minister. He is a principled and good individual. He also has competence and experience in the real world in project management. I'm grateful that we have the infrastructure minister that we have. Something that the Infrastructure Accountability Act needs to focus and develop as well is it's not only important to choose the right projects based on merit and need, but when we execute those projects in an inefficient, irresponsible way, what happens is we crowd out the ability to pursue and provide the next most important infrastructure project that might otherwise be denied funding because there is no money. And I want to give an example again using AHS. Unfortunately, we know about the Grand Prairie Hospital. Of course, there was a need there based on merit. We're not debating that. But when the Grand Prairie Hospital was announced and started in 2011, it was supposed to be completed, Mr. Speaker, in 2014. Now, Mr. Speaker, we know that the hospital was actually completed 10 years later in 2021, but it was supposed to be completed in 3 years. Not only that, Mr. Speaker, but the hospital was unfortunately over about $100 million, as I understand it, reported in the press, over budget on an $850 million budget. Mr. Speaker, we really need to be better stewards of the taxpayer dollars. Mr. Speaker, I came from the private sector. Government culture needs to spend the money as if it was their own and be very careful. Again, we need more accountability in government. Mr. Speaker, I support this act. I deny this amendment. We should seek for more accountability, especially in infrastructure, serving the public interest. And with that, Mr. Speaker, I move to adjourn debate.
Honourable members, having heard the motion to adjourn debate as proposed by the Honourable Member for Edmonton South, all those in favour, please say aye. Aye. Any opposed, please say no. No. In my opinion, the ayes have it. That motion is carried and so ordered.
Government bills and orders for second reading. Bill 79. Trails Act.
The Honorable the Government House Leader.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker, for the opportunity to rise today to move second reading of the Alberta Trails Act, Bill 79, correct, Madam Clerk? You look like we might have lost it for a minute, but I think it is Bill 79, and it's a pleasure to be here to raise it today. I have a couple things I want to talk about in regards to the Trails Act, some of it in anticipation of where the official opposition will go on this important piece of legislation. But quickly, I just want to take you back about 3 years ago, Mr. Speaker, of how we ended up with a promise inside our platform of being able of bringing a piece of legislation like a Trails Act to this chamber. And Mr. Speaker, you'll know because you were there at that time, just before, about 6 months before the last election, we saw the then government, the then NDP government, take extraordinary actions inside the Eastern Slopes, Mr. Speaker. They chose to make decisions about the area that I call home in particular, which is Clearwater County and the area west of Rocky Mountain House and west of Sundre and west of Ponoka County. They, Mr. Speaker, decided they were going to make an announcement about that beautiful area of the world. I know you spent some of your youth growing up in Nordegg, and you know it well, Mr. Speaker. And the NDP at that time, and I've always found this kind of shocking, at that time when they were going to announce a new plan for an area many times the size of Belgium, a very large area where many people call home, 3 First Nations communities call it home, the community of Rocky Mountain House, the community of Drayton Valley, the community of Sundre, the community of Rimbey, the community of Eckville, the community of Alders Flats, Caroline, and many more that are adjacent to that area. And they're going to come and make an announcement about that area. And do you think, Mr. Speaker, that they came to Rocky Mountain House to make that announcement? Or anywhere near those eastern slopes? No, Mr. Speaker, shockingly enough, they went to downtown Edmonton and took a backdrop, a nice picture of my backyard, and blew it all up, put it up inside the YMCA, I believe it was, Mr. Speaker, here right in downtown Edmonton, and made an announcement about what they were going to do inside our community. And Mr. Speaker, of course, you know, every community, every municipality voted unanimously to say they were against this plan. The 3 First Nation communities that called that area home, the Bighorn, the Ochese, and the Sunchild, said they had not been consulted on the plan and fought very, very hard in the dying months of the NDP government to be able to prevent that. And Mr. Speaker, I'm proud to say that moments after I was sworn in as the Minister of Environment and Parks, I shut down the NDP's Bighorn plan and fundamentally rejected it because that's what my community wanted, and we were proud to do that. But, Mr. Speaker, we did recognize at the time that there had to be something done to be able to create a system that could have sustainable trails and recreation management on that important landscape. Mr. Speaker, there are a lot of things that take place in that area. Often the NDP want to focus on off-highway vehicles, which I will talk about briefly in a moment, but there's a lot more things that take place inside that community, as you know, Mr. Speaker, everything from cross-country skiing, equestrian activity, hiking, hunting activities, trap lines that are inside the area, and on and on and on as communities, or as people recreate on this important landscape. And what was apparent was that the people that were keeping care of that landscape the most were volunteer organizations, were clubs, off-highway vehicle clubs, which of course we know the NDP hate. They don't like them, I get it, they made that very, very clear, but there are others, as the Friends of the Eastern Slopes, which is primarily around horse riding activities, the Bighorn Standing Committee that works with the First Nation communities in the area to provide everything from snowshoeing, cross-country skiing, hiking, and those type of other activities on the landscape. What all of those organizations have in common is that they're not the government. They're not unionized, and they operate on their own relatively well, without too much problem from the government. Most of the time, the government actually causes problems when they interfere with them and not allowing them to do their work. And Mr. Speaker, they operate basically no taxpayer dollars while maintaining the landscape that they love. And the NDP at that time came forward and said that they could do that better than them, which of course was rejected by the community. And we promised at that time that we would come forward with legislation that, one, protected the trails that these organizations have been building. And then second, would make sure that we could create frameworks that could allow those trails to be able to interact with other activities that are taking place in the landscape, stuff like forestry management zones, oil and gas activity that takes place on those landscapes and those other type of things. There was nothing within the trail disposition type of a system on public lands that would allow that to take place. And then lastly, that we would be able to put in a process that where trails were inappropriate, that we could work with those organizations to stop activities like wheels inside water and important fish habitat and those type of circumstances all across this landscape. And we did that. Now, we are doing that with the Trail Act. Now, the NDP will get very upset about this, Mr. Speaker. And the chattering classes inside the media that are essentially the NDP's press secretaries at times, some of them on this issue, will as well, because their main goal continues to be, Mr. Speaker, to block everybody from entering the landscape. When they tried to do the Bighorn Plan in that area, nobody would be allowed to access it outside of very controlled provincial park areas, and that was the way it was going to be. This bill is not that. This bill will make sure that we can protect infrastructure that is being invested inside these landscapes, help these organizations that actually care about these landscapes to be able to continue their important conservation work. Now, Mr. Speaker, one of the things that really upset these organizations who, in many cases, had volunteered for decades to be able to create these type of recreation opportunities inside the Eastern Slopes was that the fact when the NDP was going to do this, and they did it in the Crow's Nest as well, it was going to just wipe out all of the investment that can come from private dollars to be able to create those trails. This act will make sure no government in the future can do that. It will protect and respect the investment of organizations who are working with the department to put bridges in, to be able to make sure you can do water crossings in environmentally friendly ways, and to be able to create infrastructure that people can use for generations to come. Now, Mr. Speaker, one thing I do want to get across very much today, and I'll have more to say as we get to committee of the whole, is that at its core, this will protect and respect organizations that want to work in the Eastern Slopes with us. Those organizations we depend on. And now, Mr. Speaker, I've spoken inside this chamber many times about a great organization called the Friends of the Eastern Slopes. They are an organization around the Aha-Tinda Ranch. And back in the 80s, the federal government, who has the ranch, operates the ranch since the Brewster brothers sold it to them in just before Confederation, I believe, Mr. Speaker, or just afterwards. Albertans love to go there for many different types of recreation activities. It's a worldwide horseback riding destination, world famous. Everybody who is a horse person loves or knows about the Aha-Tinda. Some people dream their whole lives of coming from all over the world to be able to have an opportunity to go horseback riding there. Also a great spot to elk hunt, Mr. Speaker, and a pretty special location. And in the 80s, it was getting damaged. And so the federal government at that time made a decision to ban everybody from being able to enter the ranch. The ranch is a working ranch. It raises and trains all of the horses that are used in the National Park Service in the entire country up inside the Aha-Tinda Ranch. If you never had the privilege of being there, I know you have, Mr. Speaker, but if some of our colleagues have not, I highly encourage them to come and have a visit. So it's shut because of some inappropriate activity that was taking place there while the National Park Services was running. And inside Mountaineer Lodge, a couple of years after that, a lodge that I had the privilege of running for many, many years and calling home, was a meeting that took place in the early 90s. And a group formed themselves called the Friends of the Eastern Slopes that came together, and they convinced the National Park Service to turn over that area to them as volunteers. They would do their own fundraising, and they would volunteer together to be able to make sure that they could access this beautiful spot. And they did that. And I'm proud to say, Mr. Speaker, we're now 30-some years later, and that organization is still running one of the most beautiful places in the world. And Mr. Speaker, if you ever drive up there, you'll see it. And you'll see how spectacular it is, frankly, compared to things that are run by both the provincial government and the federal government that are right adjacent to it. You'll see that the model is better. That is the model the NDP want to reject. And it's one of the reasons why they fight against important legislation like this. The other organization that they don't want us to partner with, but don't worry, we're going to get this bill passed, I suspect, Mr. Speaker, is the Alberta Trailnet Society, which is working to connect the Trans-Canada Trail throughout Alberta and are currently developing a portion of the trail that passes on the north side of Lesser Slave Lake. As well, Mr. Speaker, I'm proud to say to you, Mr. Speaker, that beyond off-highway vehicles, this bill is supported by the Alberta Hiking Association, which represents over 2 million hikers across Alberta and helps local hiking groups promote their activities. And of course, the Crow's Nest Quad Squad and the Crow's Nest Pass has dedicated hundreds of hours and hundreds of thousands of dollars to building water crossings, repairing erosion, and ensuring that their off-highway vehicle activities can continue on the landscape. And then our partners at the Alberta Snowmobile Association, which maintains thousands of kilometers of snowmobile trails in every corner of the province. Their executive director, Mr. Speaker, Chris, told me last week that they have been advocating for legislation like this bill since 1999. And then the Nordic Alberta, which supports local cross-country ski clubs in maintaining their trails and has been doing so for generations. These are just a few examples of the groups that we will empower with this legislation, and most importantly, Mr. Speaker, that we will make sure are protected, that their work is protected for generations to come. The other thing I want to briefly talk about while I am introducing this bill, Mr. Speaker, is around the concept that I have seen the official opposition against some of their chattering classes in the media already speaking about, that this somehow will create chaos on the landscape. The reality is, Mr. Speaker, nothing could be further from the truth. This bill is based on a joint project that was done between the County of Clearwater and the Alberta government called the Clearwater Trail Initiative, in which there was a grant given to Clearwater County at the time. And Clearwater County is an interesting place, Mr. Speaker. It has, on some long weekends, over 100,000 people camped outside of Rocky Mountain House, which is a community of just about 7,500 people. So there's a lot of people that come out to this area. And Clearwater County went out and they put a Sasquatch sign. It's a big Sasquatch. Anybody who's been to Rocky Mountain House has seen it. Those are not my campaign posters. That's actually part of the trail initiative there. And certainly there's a likeness, Mr. Speaker. It might be one of my brothers. But they would put those signs up in areas where it was good to go ATVing, it was good to go horseback riding, good places to camp. They put that up and recommended. They didn't focus on shutting things down. They focused on showing people where it was okay to go and working with organizations to be able to make sure they could deal with things like water crossings or other things in those areas. And what they found was about 99%, Mr. Speaker, of people that came and saw that Sasquatch sign understood where to go, used the infrastructure appropriately, and went on with their time. That's what happens when you invest inside a trail system, Mr. Speaker, to make sure that people can use it. Mr. Speaker, I got a lot more that I'm going to talk about in detail when we get to Committee of the Whole. But at the end of the day, why I am so passionate about this is beyond the modern uses that we have for trails. Our trail system in our country and in our province has a tremendous amount of historical value, not only in how it contributes to our everyday life, recreation, and our physical health as Albertans now. But of course, coming from an area like I come from, Mr. Speaker, again, a place you grew up in Nordic, it has a history for several centuries since David Thompson himself came and founded the town of Rocky Mountain House. And before that, of course, our First Nation communities have called that area home since the beginning of time, Mr. Speaker. And some of those historical trails we still use today. I was telling my staff when we were writing up this piece of legislation about one of my favorite trails, west of Rocky Mountain House, that is marked still to this day, Mr. Speaker. The turn that you will take in the backcountry with your horse is marked by a rock that was engraved by David Thompson over 2 centuries ago to be able to mark his path as he would go over the eastern slopes and into BC. Until this act is passed, those trails aren't protected. At any time, something could happen, industrial activity, logging, other things that are taking place on the landscape, and those are important activities for our economic health and are very, very valued by our community. But without an important piece of legislation like this to be able to identify that important historical place and the value of that important trail, it could eventually just be plowed over. Now, with this legislation, there'll be a way for those organizations who are protecting these trails to be able to interact with that trail appropriately and to be able to make sure that it is protected for generations to come. Mr. Speaker, if passed, the Trails Act and the associate amendments will establish the cornerstones for a sustainable trail management system on public land. It will enable trails to be designated for specific uses such as hiking or riding and off-highway vehicles. It will enable improved trail planning, which will consider other land use values. It will strengthen protection of trails so that Albertans can enjoy them for years to come. It will enable better enforcement tools to prevent environmental damage and promote environmental stewardship of public land. And it will promote a bigger role for partners in managing trails and their maintenance. And Mr. Speaker, most importantly, it is a fulfillment of a platform commitment and a commitment to Albertans who value their trails and their recreation on the important landscapes inside our province, Mr. Speaker, and will make sure that those organizations' work is valued and will prevent the NDP from doing the horrendous thing that they tried to do 3 years ago to a community in West Central Alberta, the horrendous thing that they did to communities inside Crow's Nest Pass, which was to try to block them from their own backyards and try to stop them from being able to recreate in their backyards in the way that they have for generations, Mr. Speaker. This act will make sure we protect that for the future and make sure that we can continue to recreate on the landscape the way we have for generations, Mr. Speaker, while protecting our environment.
Honourable members before the Assembly, the Trails Act. The Honourable Member for Calgary Mountain View is risen.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I am incredibly pleased to rise to speak to this bill, and especially to speak to this bill after that particular performance by the minister, Mr. Speaker. I have seen some sales jobs and some rhetoric in my time. I don't think I have ever seen anything that rises to quite that level. So, Mr. Speaker, let us begin with what this bill does not do. It does not, in fact, fulfill an election promise. In fact, it explicitly fails to fulfill such an election promise, which was made by the UCP to bring in a user fee for OHVs. This act does not, Mr. Speaker, do that. In addition, the minister indicated that he was going to bring in such a user fee. So why would that be important, Mr. Speaker? Well, it's important because this government already is charging Albertans to, quote unquote, use their own backyard. Hikers, campers, day users, anyone entering the Kananaskis area is now subject to a fee. And when that fee was introduced, it was noted by several members of the public and organizations and basically everyone that the fee applied to hikers and campers in Kananaskis. It did not apply to McLean Creek, which is primarily OHV use, despite the fact that on average, OHV use tends to cause more damage to the environment. The minister had suggested that the reason that we needed this fee in Kananaskis to be charged was because individuals should pay for the upkeep of the trail, and apparently that goes for hikers and campers, but not for OHV users. This act does not address that problem. In addition, it doesn't address the actual problem that we have, which is to say that we need to adjudicate between uses. It is not possible to continue using these areas at the rate that they are presently used, while also ensuring that we have access to the same historical environment, that we have fish to fish, and that we have wildlife in its habitat. So this is a problem which arises not because the quote-unquote, as the minister put it, chattering class invented it, not because scientists invented it, not because the NDP invented it, but because it simply exists. You cannot just do whatever you want with an environment and expect it to stay exactly the same. Human actions have consequences. And in this case, they can potentially have detrimental consequences. And so it is not on those individual people to know that. It is not on those individual users to figure out how many other users happen to be in that area. It is on the government to regulate, to make a determination in terms of who gets to use what area for what purposes. And this is important. I will quote here from an article, from a CBC article, which I'm happy to table later. The article is entitled, "Scientists Say New Alberta Trails Act Threatens Already Stressed Environment." And the sort of central point of this is, and I'm quoting here, "But at least 4 peer-reviewed government-funded studies have concluded that the road trail densities are already harming populations of animals such as caribou, grizzly bears, and bull trout. That is especially true in the province's southwestern foothills and mountains where off-highway vehicle use has long been popular." Now, unlike what the minister claims, I have no dislike for OHV users. I know many. I am happy for them to use their vehicles. And in fact, many responsible OHV users, one cited in the very article to which I am currently referring, many responsible OHV users would like for there to be some rules set up so that everyone uses responsibly. And I think that that's fair. Continuing to quote, the Livingstone Porcupine Hills plan for the area, a legal document, stipulates no more than 0.4 kilometers of trail for every square kilometer in the most sensitive zones and no more than 0.6 kilometers everywhere else. Government estimates already put the density in that area between 0.9 and 5.9 kilometers for every square kilometer. So that is the primary concern. That is the situation which this does not address. So it doesn't address the environmental concerns. It doesn't address the inequity in terms of who is charged a fee for using the land versus who isn't charged a fee for using the land. It also has some concerning provisions. Now, arguably, this bill doesn't actually add anything new. It doesn't add really anything over and above what was sort of available already in terms of the Public Land Administration, or sorry, the Public Lands Act and the Public Lands Administration Regulation. So the one interesting thing that it does do, it claims to give paramountcy to the Public Lands Act and allowing that to sort of prevail to the extent of the inconsistency. But it has a really interesting regulation-making power. Now, I know not that many people are into regulation-making powers, but I read a lot of legislation when we were in government. One of the jobs of the Minister of Justice in any government is to chair what is called the Legislative Review Committee, which means reading all the government's legislation. Many people aren't that into that. In fact, I would say the vast majority of my colleagues were not that into that. I happen to really, really enjoy that particular work. And one of the things that I really tended to look at was regulation-making power. And I don't think I've ever actually seen a regulation-making power like this. So it's a deficiency regulation, which means essentially where something isn't addressed in legislation, but it's very oddly worded. So Section 10, sub 1, the Lieutenant Governor and Council may make regulations, and there's an A, but then B says, remedying any confusion in the application or any difficulty or impossibility in applying any provisions of this act, which is really interesting. And so sort of looping back to the A, it also allows the Lieutenant Governor and Council, and that's Cabinet, just on the off chance that anyone's listening to this, modifying the provisions of the Public Lands Administration Regulation to make those provisions applicable in respect of a designated trail or designated trail area. So these are interesting. B in particular was something I hadn't really seen before. And so I thought I would go looking to see if anyone else had this question, and luckily for me, it turns out someone has. So I am now moving to an article on what's called A-blog, and that's for the benefit of Hansard, spelled A-B-L-A-W-G, and it's at ablog.ca. The article is entitled, Alberta Heads the Wrong Direction with Bill 79, the Proposed Trails Act. And it is by Professors Sean Fluker and David Mayhood. So it talks about exactly this provision. So it turns out someone else has had this question. It references it, and then it sort of references the fact that, you know, these are the sorts of these are the sorts of deficiencies that the legislature itself should be remedying, or should alternately have been addressed, you know, before the bill was passed into law. So they go on to say, and I'm quoting now, Our curiosity with Section 10 led us to undertake a quick survey of legislation across Canada to see how often regulation-making power is granted to remedy confusion or an impossibility. A search of the term impossibility within 10 words of regulation produced only 61 hits in the National CanLII database. Interestingly, most of the legislation contained this sort of provision had been enacted in only 2 provinces, Alberta and Manitoba. Perhaps the most noteworthy is the scope of this type of regulation-making power is always limited to address one of 2 instances: difficulty or an impossibility that arises in relation to a transition from a repealed legislation to new legislation, a difficulty or impossibility that arises from the dissolution of a statutory entity. So in both of these instances, what is being said here is that nowhere in Canada does a law like this exist that isn't trying to apply to essentially the legislature repealing something. So either they're removing the existence of a statutory entity or they've sort of repealed and replaced a piece of legislation. And those sorts of things can have unintended consequences. So you would imagine that a regulation-making power like this would be useful in those instances. The question is, what's it doing here? Because it isn't dealing with a situation where you're sort of repealing something and bringing something in new, or you're dissolving a previously existing agency. It's dealing with a law that's in place and will continue to be in place versus the law that we're passing right now. And so to me, what this says is that something very questionable is occurring. I would urge the public, I mean they are already, but I would definitely urge the public to kind of question what it is that's attempting to happen here. Because again, in terms of the goals the minister has stated for what this legislation is going to do, it doesn't achieve them. Aside from ensuring that people continue to be able to recreate, it doesn't modernize anything. It certainly doesn't improve environmental impact. In fact, it does quite the opposite. So the main concern that we have with this, and I know the government has tried to create this us and them narrative where there's regular people and then there's the quote-unquote chattering classes, which is a thing this government does frequently. They've been doing it since they were in opposition. It's a problematic tactic for a number of reasons. But I think the real concern here is that Albertans are concerned, and they have a right to be concerned. Albertans were concerned when this government proposed unilaterally, without consultation to them, to begin coal mining in the eastern slopes. They stood up against that. Albertans were concerned when this government came in and unilaterally imposed fees on them to use Kananaskis, an area they had historically always had access to. They were particularly concerned that users of Kananaskis were expected to pay a fee, whereas users of McLean Creek were not expected to pay the same fee, despite arguably more impact on the landscape and needing more funds in order to ensure that those trails were properly tended. So I think this bill is a major concern. At best, it achieves absolutely nothing. And in achieving nothing, it doesn't fulfill a promise made by the minister, made by this government in their campaign promise to Albertans. And in addition to that, it potentially walks things backwards. Now, another concern is that the whole point of this, the whole point of management of trails is supposed to be that we are worried about cumulative impacts on the land. And what that requires is that we do land use planning. We consider what we want to protect, how we want the landscape to be in the future, what we want to leave to our children, and we plan to use the land in such a way that that continues to be the case. That's what the point of land use planning is. It allows some users to use some areas, some users to use other areas. It sort of regulates as between different individuals because, again, as the population of Alberta increases and the land continues to not have the capacity to sort of bear increased use, we need to adjudicate essentially between whose turns. I mean, essentially what we're talking about here is, you know, making a lineup for a slide, right? Deciding whose turn it is when. But that land use planning hasn't been done by this government. And so this does nothing to remedy that fact. In fact, it doesn't really give the minister additional powers to kind of strengthen environmental protection. It might give him additional powers to override environmental protection, potentially. So this is a big concern, and it's particularly a big concern because of who it's coming from. This is a government that demonstrated a complete lack of respect for Albertans. They went ahead with repealing a coal policy that was brought in by that radical Peter Lougheed, because they felt that it was, I guess, too left-leaning, that it provided too much protection to our environment. And, you know, I know the government wants to say it's the chattering classes, as they put it, that objected to this, but it wasn't. It was everyone. It was hikers, it was scientists, it was ranchers, it was farmers, it was people who lived in towns that were in the watershed area. Pretty much everyone resoundingly objected to that plan. And that is one of the reasons that when they come forward with a bill that does, at best, nothing, and at worst, essentially works to roll back and undercut what limited environmental protections exist now, that's pretty problematic. This government has demonstrated a complete disrespect for our natural environment and for anyone that cares about it. And so I think that we should all be, you know, deeply concerned about this bill. And I don't think that that is unreasonable. I would invite the minister, he keeps speaking extensively about how he'll speak more at committee of the whole, or even in his closing comments here, here in second reading. I would invite the minister to explain, you know, 2 or 3 instances in which he plans to use those particular deficiency regulations, and explain why he needs this power if he did his homework and made sure that there weren't these conflicts. I would like an explanation for why it is they claim that this fulfills an election promise, when in fact that promise was clear in black and white to apply fees equitably, to ensure, to bring in a fee on OHV use, and they haven't done that in here. And that's fine. You know, if the government doesn't want to charge fees on things, I think that's their choice. But then explain how they plan to pay for the upkeeps of those trails, because their argument with respect to Kananaskis was, there's no possible way. I mean, it's been done throughout history, but there's no possible way for us to do it without charging these fees. So I would love to hear what the explanation for that inconsistency is. But again, you know, the concerns around this bill, the sort of major concerns, is that we are, for the most part, already above the number of trails that we ought to have. So we are already at the point where all of our evidence tells us we are doing environmental damage, that the environment we hand to our children will not be the same one that we ourselves have enjoyed. And that won't just affect our enjoyment of the land. It will affect our agriculture. It will affect multiple uses. And I think that that is something about which we should be incredibly concerned, because some of this damage, once done, cannot easily be remedied. So I think, Mr. Speaker, this act is incredibly concerning. It's not at all clear to me that it achieves any of the minister's stated goals. And I think this takes us backwards. And so I find this act problematic. I will be objecting to it. I will not be voting in favor of it. And I hope that this government will provide some sort of explanation for what way they could possibly think it attains the stated goals.
Honourable members on the Trails Act. I see the Honourable Member for Banff Kananaskis has risen.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. As the MLA for beautiful Banff Kananaskis, I am super excited to rise today and speak in support of this bill. Alberta is the natural place to host a world-class, world-famous recreational tourism industry. We have the natural beauty, we have the mountains, we have the backcountry, we have phenomenal landscapes. We're the natural place to host this recreational tourism industry, but we need to have recreational assets to be able to do that. And this act actually propels that forwards and enables us to do that. So I actually wasn't going to speak today, but I did feel the need to stand up after the previous member's speech and refute a couple of things that were said. I thought it was quite funny, actually, that, well, actually, I'll start by saying, Mr. Speaker, when our Honourable Minister for Environment and Parks gave his speech tonight, he talked a lot about how our NDP opposition wants nothing more than to shut Albertans out of the backcountry. And the Honourable Member for Calgary Mountain View refuted that and suggested, I believe, that his speech was a quote-unquote performance. While subsequently going on to say a couple things, I would note, that highlight exactly the validity of what the minister had said. The Honourable Member specifically highlighted a news article in which it was quoted that the Trails Act threatens the already overused trail system in Alberta. And then it was also stated that, quote unquote, we already have above the number of trails we ought to have. Well, Mr. Speaker, nothing is more clear about a claim to shut Albertans out of the backcountry than an honourable member, quote unquote, saying we already have far above the numbers of trails we ought to have, and the Trails Act threatens an already used space. We just ought to keep Albertans out of them. So, Mr. Speaker, make no mistake, the NDP's primary goal is to keep Albertans out of the wilderness, prohibit them from recreating in the world-class, God-given, most beautiful place on planet Earth, which I have the honor of representing. So I just want to be clear, yes, I would love to give way.
Thank you, member from Banff Kananaskis, for giving way to your colleague right next door. Would you be able to speak to what would happen in your constituency if the NDP had its way and sanitized Albertans out of the backcountry? What would happen if we cleared Albertans out of the beautiful landscapes that we enjoy, the mountains that we hike and we climb, the rivers we canoe down, and the trails that we walk on, to the good constituents of Banff Kananaskis?
Mr. Speaker, thank you to my colleague. Banff Kananaskis would go bankrupt. That is what happens. Mr. Speaker, we thrive on recreational tourism in Banff Kananaskis. I have said it 1,000 times in this House. There are a million destinations on planet Earth that pride themselves on man-made attractions, but here in Alberta, and specifically in Banff Kananaskis, we have a recreational tourism industry based on the God-given beauty all around us. Recreational tourism contributes $5.4 billion to Alberta's GDP already, the equivalent of 77,000 full-time equivalent jobs. To put that into perspective, that is 6.1 times the employment rate of both the forestry and the logging industries, Mr. Speaker. Recreational tourism is a significant economic driver, but we are actually bleeding billions of dollars to BC, who does an even better job than we do, and that's why we need to step our game up and promote recreational tourism industry. We need to promote legislation that allows us to propel this industry forward, create trails, create recreational tourism assets. So, Mr. Speaker, we already need to do more, and I can see my honourable colleague mocking my hand gestures. That's okay, I'm a hands talker, but This industry is so critically important to the area that I represent. We are the tourism driver of this province, and that is based on recreational tourism. And that's why I support this act, because this act enables us to continue to build on that recreational tourism foundation that we have. And sorry, I did not see you. I will give way.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I think it's probably worth rising just to ask the member a couple of questions, since she represents the area, so I assume she's heard the same concerns as I do. Now, she takes the position that the article I quoted, which was quoting from scientific peer-reviewed articles, which stated in the article that we had a higher density of trails than was permitted under the land use planning. I'm just wondering if she's heard from constituents in her riding who have actually said that that isn't true, because she stood in this place and she said that the statements I made were inaccurate and incorrect. She's misrepresented the things that I said, which were that we need to reduce the numbers of trails, not that we need to stop having trails. And so I would love to know if she's never heard those concerns from anyone in her constituency.
Thank you, Honourable Member. And I can actually factually say that no, I have literally never heard one of my constituents ask me to make less trails and to prohibit access to the backcountry. Canmore and Banff are the most sought-after destinations to live in, arguably in the entire world. And the reason people move there to live there is so that they can have access to recreate there. People don't move there to sit on their balconies and drink wine and stare at the mountains. Everyone in my constituency is more fit than I could ever aspire to be, because they recreate every day. They hike, they climb, they mountain bike, they downhill ski, they cross-country ski. So, Mr. Speaker, I can actually literally say that I have literally never once heard a constituent ask for less access to their own backyard. And I would also like to say that no, I did not misrepresent the Honourable Member. I just directly quoted her. But one other thing that the Honourable Member said in her speech, and I will again directly quote, I will not misrepresent, I will directly quote, it was said that this act does nothing, but it actually does the complete opposite. Well, Mr. Speaker, I don't think you can do opposite of nothing. So in order to do the opposite of something, you have to do something in the first place. So what this act does, Mr. Speaker, because I would love to tell you, because I am so proud of it, what this act does are two key things. In my area, one of the largest problems is that we have this expansive trail network that's been put together with over, I believe, 160,000 volunteer hours. And this trail network is put together entirely by volunteers, by not-for-profits. And these groups, every time they want to build a new trail or maintain an existing trail, or even so much as move a twig off a trail that's in the way, they basically have to reapply for permission to the Department of Environment and Parks, go through the entire regulatory process to get permission to do that thing to that trail. Well, what this bill will do, Mr. Speaker, is it will allow those groups who have been stewards of this land for decades, who have spent over 100,000 volunteer hours and donations to build these trail networks, to be designated as trail managers. And it treats them with the dignity and the respect that they've deserved for years, and tells them that, you know what, every time you want to maintain a trail that you've actually built yourself on volunteer hours and donations, we'll let you. We trust you because you've already done a good job. And now these groups can apply, rather than apply on a per trail basis, they can apply to be trail managers, and they can be designated an entire region and said, this is yours. You've built it, you've maintained it for decades, you've funded it through private donations. It's yours, and you can take care of it because we trust these people to do a great job. A better job, I would note, that the government could do and has been able to do in the past. But one other great thing that this act does is it designates trails as Crown assets for the first time. And Mr. Speaker, anyone who represents a recreational area, and this is no slight of the logging industry, I do want to note that forestry and logging play a very important role in Banff Kananaskis as well. But there has always been a conflict. It's the age-old tale of the conflict between the recreational tourism industry and the forestry industry. And that's because the forestry industry has always had precedent over the recreational tourism industry, because recreational tourism has never been treated with the dignity that it deserves as a true economic driver in this province. And so what happens is when a new forest management plan is approved, oftentimes the trails that have been built with hundreds of thousands of volunteer hours are disregarded. There is no requirement of forestry companies to maintain them, work around them, rebuild them, or relocate them if they want to log there. And oftentimes the logging companies will do this out of respect for the trails managers, but they've previously had no formal obligation to. But what this bill will do is it will designate those trails as Crown assets, which means they belong to the government. They are finally designated as a true entity. They're not just a trail that's been dug through the weeds, through the twigs, that can be just steamrolled and disregarded. For the first time, these trails will be something that cannot be disregarded. They will be something that if a forestry company, and I will give way in one moment, wants to come into that area, they will have a duty and an obligation to either maintain that trail, protect that trail, work around that trail, or to relocate that trail if they need to forest that area. But it will provide balance and certainty to a recreational and tourism industry, and I will give way again.
Thank you to the member from Banff Kananaskis for giving way. Now, the member preceding you made a few points about the environmental damage that the bill will do. You seem to think otherwise. Now, are there any trail groups in the province, these notorious industrialists and famously nefarious capitalists and climate skeptics that support this legislation?
Well, thank you. There sure is. In fact, trails groups from almost every sector of recreational trail use have endorsed this bill. We've got the Alberta Snowmobile Association, the Alberta Hiking Association, the Alberta Off-Highway Vehicle Association, Alberta Trailnet Society. Mr. Speaker, no matter what kind of recreation you do on what kind of trail you do it on, they've endorsed this bill, and that's because this bill has been done through thorough consultation, and it honors exactly what these people have wanted for years, which is to be stewards of these areas and to protect the areas that they recreate on and treat them as important pieces of Alberta's economic future. So, Mr. Speaker, I'm going to conclude my remarks. I will note that the honourable member highlighted the nefarious trail users, and it's funny because people oftentimes look to British Columbia as the pinnacle of what of doing environmental protection right. A very strong environmentalist base in British Columbia. They place environmental protection as a very high priority. And that's great, but what's interesting to note is that British Columbia is arguably the #1 destination in Canada for supporting and expanding access to recreational trails. Not only do they have trails, they have crazy things like lift-assisted bike lifts, like you would see on a ski hill on their Crown lands, Mr. Speaker. So the place that supports the environmental conservation to the highest extent in Canada also has found a way to support recreational tourism to the highest extent. And that is a balance that is phenomenal, and a balance that we can and need to achieve in Alberta. So in closing, I just want to highlight a couple other things that our government has done for environmental record, because it's actually an environmental record that I'm very proud of, especially as it pertains to my local constituency. And it is a record that I feel the opposition members tend to call into question a lot of times and suggest that initiatives like the Kananaskis Conservation Pass are really just a tax grab that have no positive impact on Albertans. So just a couple things in closing, Mr. Speaker, to highlight our environmental record. Not just across Alberta, but right where I live specifically, on Crown land and in provincial parks. Mr. Speaker, we are expanding the provincial park landmass of Bow Valley Provincial Park. Let's just say that one more time, Mr. Speaker. We're not selling it, we're not shrinking it. We are expanding the size of Bow Valley Provincial Park. On top of already expanding a provincial wildland park in northern Alberta, I believe to be the largest provincial park in the province. That's 2 provincial parks we have not just shrunk, we have made larger, Mr. Speaker, to be the largest parks in the province. We've hired 20 conservation officers for this province. 20 in one swoop. That's more than the opposition hired in full 4 years. We consolidated, I believe, 15 various phone numbers that people could call to report public lands issues. We've consolidated 15 of them into one. 310 land, you can call it if you've got an environmental conservation issue, problem, a wildlife encounter. You can call this one phone number and receive easy access to safe and accessible resources. And finally, Mr. Speaker, we are actually building well, everyone knows it's not actually. We've funded the very first wildlife overpass outside of a national park in Alberta's history. $25 million, Mr. Speaker. We funded it in budget number 1. We didn't even delay 3 years. We funded it in our very first budget to show Albertans that environmental conservation and human wildlife mitigation is a top priority for this government. And those are just some initiatives in my riding. There's lots more. I mentioned the provincial park up north. We're investing in extended producer liability, all kinds of wonderful environmental conservation initiatives, Mr. Speaker. So I am proud to support the Trails Act. I am proud to support recreational tourism. I'm proud to support the industry and expand the industry, and I'm very proud to support this government's environmental record.
Hear, hear. Are there others? The honourable member for Edmonton Manning, and she will be followed by the honourable member for Calgary East.
Well, thank you, honourable member. I'm interested to speak to this piece of legislation. Just a couple things that I want to start off with in response to the honourable member that just spoke. So my family's in BC, live on the island, and spend obviously a lot of time hiking and camping and enjoying the beautiful landscapes of the island. The fun fact about that is that when they go camping, because we had this conversation over the summer, because I'm an avid camper too, and I'll tell you, this year was a very expensive year to be going camping in Alberta. Being able to get a campsite, paying the fees, all the things associated were substantial in comparison to British Columbia. So same campsite that I would pay $42 a night in Alberta, plus firewood, plus all the other things that were attached to that, my parents pay $25. So part of the reason why British Columbia does so well with their tourism industry and why they do so well with being able to encourage people to be outdoors and people enjoy going to BC is because the fees that are now required to pay in Alberta are nothing in comparison to British Columbia. There is a substantial difference in getting out and being active in British Columbia than there is in Alberta. And we know that because we've now seen a fee in Kananaskis. We've seen provincial park fees increased. We've seen the cost of firewood fees increased. We've seen basically any opportunity to increase a fee on Albertans to access their own backyard with this government. There is a big difference with the cost of access in Alberta than there is in British Columbia. And so, you know, I can go hiking in Campbell River where my parents are, and there's no fee. And there's beautiful parks there. Elk Falls, they just built a suspension bridge over the falls, and it's free. Free parking, free all the things. And so there's just a big difference, a substantial difference between accessing the back areas in British Columbia and Alberta. Now, I have family that also lives up in the Hinton area. And so the interesting thing about that is that they've seen the damage caused by OHVs. And the fact that my cousin even actually said, he's like, you know, I wouldn't have a problem paying a fee if I knew that the fee that I was paying was actually going to restore the trails and was actually going to clean up the area. Because as someone who lives around Hinton who goes and uses Crown land, I protect that area when I go out there. But I can go to the exact same area a weekend later and someone's gone out there and dumped a whole bunch of stuff and all the things, and nobody's out there cleaning it up. So they're paying a fee to use Crown land, and we had a promise from this government to say that there was going to be people monitoring it, that it was going to get cleaned up, all the things, and yet that hasn't happened. So I appreciate that the member opposite was talking about, you know, we want trail managers, this legislation allows trail managers. Well, it's one thing to have a nonprofit group of volunteers going out on an existing trail and cleaning up the brush and the trees that have fallen down and making sure that you can still access it. It's another thing to give complete permission for creation of new trails without having to go through environmental processes. That's a problem. And it's a problem, and we know this, and I'm sure the Minister of Agriculture and Forestry would be very sensitive to this, as well as the Minister of Environment. But we've got some pretty endangered species in this province. We know the trout is an issue. We know caribou is a problem. We know that our grizzly bear population is also protected under SARA. And so because of that, there are reasons why environmental protections are put in place. There are reasons why, when we look at how we develop our trail system, how forestry accesses their FMAs and their land management agreements, those environmental protections are put in place. And so to say, well, we want to be able to have trail managers who can just decide in a section of land around our beautiful area like Kananaskis, or up north by Fort McMurray, or down south, and they don't have to go through the environmental process, is an absolute problem. And it's a problem because we know that there are legal thresholds that have to be abided by when looking at developing these recreational areas. There absolutely is. It's not just provincially regulated, it's regulated federally. SARA being a prime example, and people will get frustrated with, why do we have to manage the caribou, because they're quite sensitive to their environments. Trout, we know that when you're going up a strip line, or you're going on into the Crown land, that you're probably going to cross a river at some point. You need to make sure that if that's happening, that those areas are being monitored. So, we hear from the government talking about, well, we have validators. Well, we also have validators that are concerned. And they're concerned. Alberta scientists and environmentalists say proposed legislation governing backcountry trails on public land will thwart efforts to restore nature and add one or more stressors to the already overtaxed landscape. The Environment Minister said that the Trails Act awaiting second reading legislature will not close any trails and will lay out a path for new ones. But part of the province are already over the legal thresholds as required, and they have linear disturbances. Anything from a road to a cut line to a pathway. So some wonder how the bill's intent is to open new access when we already are over capacity from a legal requirement. What's missing in the Act is trail closures in sensitive wildlife habitats. We're making forestry companies do it. They're having to reevaluate their FMA agreements. They're having to do community consultations right now to access more fiber because we know that they're in high caribou density areas. And unfortunately, that piece continues to be missed in the conversation. So it's not just about recreation. I support recreation. I love being outside. If I could go camping all summer, I would. I have a job, so I can't. But there's hiking, all those things that I enjoy doing. I also do it with the understanding that I have a responsibility to be a good environmental steward. And I have to be responsible and understand that there are species that are at risk in many of those areas, and that we have to make sure that there is a balance between the extension of our trail programs and what is going on in this act, and the responsibility that we have to protect those wildlife species. And I don't see that happening. Sometimes trails have to be closed. We know that sometimes grizzly bears move into new areas, they den, and when they den, they come out in the spring, they take over an area. There are trails that are closed in federal parks all the time because of safety issues interactions between humans and bears. Cougars, for example, also. So this isn't a new concept to all of a sudden say we have to have some ability to be able to keep some trails open and close others. It isn't restricting access. That's keeping people safe and the wildlife that they are interacting with safe. Because we don't want species, and I would think that the member that spoke previously would be very aware of the interaction between bears in the Kananaskis region with humans, and how many animals have to be moved or unfortunately euthanized because they interact with humans to such an extent that they become no longer safe to be around. That's because humans are moving into wildlife spaces. It is a fact. So, now, I don't think that we should be looking at closing trails, as the Honourable Minister likes to think that we like to say. I disagree. I believe in tourism. I think it's important that we have a tourism industry where people can come to Alberta and access Waterton and access, you know, the Crow's Nest Pass and all of those beautiful areas that I spent a lot of time in when I was a child. And now moving up into the Yellowhead area, like I spend a lot of time up there as well. I think we need to do that, but we don't need to do it in such a fashion where we just open up the area and say we're just going to put a whole bunch of trails through it. We're going to allow all of this access, and we're going to remove all of the environmental responsibility, and we're not going to say people have to apply for regulatory responsibility to make sure that those areas are being protected. I disagree. We expect it from everywhere else. Oil and gas has expectations, forestry, they must do it, agriculture must do it. All of these other industries that are interacting with our landscapes have responsibilities. And so it is a big question mark as to why the removal of those requirements, what this government would say is red tape, when in fact what it is ensuring that we're making sure that our environments are not only sustainable, but that the animals that are in those environments are also being protected. Because the last thing we want to do is start saying we're just going to keep opening up trails, we're going to allow people to use OHVs wherever they want, all the things, and then our beautiful landscape that we're so proud of becomes something where people come to visit and there's garbage everywhere and there's trails everywhere and people are getting hurt because they're being attacked by animals, and we hear all these stories, and all of a sudden Alberta's reputation is in question. Maybe it's not so safe to go hiking in Kananaskis because the grizzly bears keep chasing people away. Or I was just hiking on this beautiful trail and like there's a big mud line right through the river because someone went through on their OHV the other day and brought up all the mud. So there is a balance. The balance doesn't exist in this legislation. So I appreciate what the member opposite was trying to say. I think bringing in, well, you know, forestry can create lines and then they do all these things and then, you know, they're wrecking the landscape and stuff. They have a responsibility. They have to be able to repatriate the land. They have to make sure that those lines and those access roads that they're using are reforested. They have a whole bunch of regulatory requirements from an environmental perspective that must be completed when they go in and are harvesting. So it's not just like they go in, they make a whole bunch of trails, they wreck the landscape, and then that's it. And in fact, that's a really dangerous message for a government member to be saying about forestry. Because they are environmental stewards, they do take care of the land, and they protect the environments that they're working in. And I think as government members, we should be very cautious when we start saying that forestry just goes in and rips out trees and makes trails and damages a whole bunch of land. Because they won't appreciate that very much, being one of our biggest economic drivers. So, those are my comments in regards to what the member opposite said. Now, we can speak again to Honourable Member. Please go ahead.
Thank you. And to the member opposite, I always appreciate her comments because it is well thought, typically, and well thought out. But I believe that there was a bit of a mischaracterization from the speech from my fellow colleague from Banff Kananaskis. I don't believe that she said that you know, and I'm not going to use the exact quote, so I apologize for that, but basically alluded to ripping and tearing and rip and tear and pull hair. That's not what forestry does, and that's not what she said. What she was saying was that the trail systems themselves would have a similar standing as to what the trail groups themselves as to forestry and logging. So making them a Crown asset would then allow for better integration between the two, giving precedence also to the trails, taking that into consideration rather than just going over top of them. Now, coming from that area of Hinton and logging and having that as my own background, I know full well what the member from Banff Kananaskis was saying, so just a bit of a clarification.
2 minutes and 20 seconds remaining.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I appreciate the time check. And thank you to the Honourable Member opposite for bringing up his background in forestry. Also have one. Very clear about my understanding of forestry and how it works. And in fact, we're very amazing supporters of my community that I grew up in. And without them, we wouldn't have had the community that we have. Or the trail lines that we have, because they actually took care of the area and made sure we had access to them. So, little sensitive around forestry, there's no question. You know, Honorable Speaker, I could keep going, but recognizing the time, I will actually adjourn debate on this piece of legislation.
Thank you, Honourable Member. All those members in favour to adjourn debate as proposed by the Honourable Member for Edmonton Manning, all those in favour, please say aye. Aye. Any opposed, please say no. That is carried and so ordered.
Government bills and orders for second reading. Bill 77, Municipal Government Restoring Tax Accountability Amendment Act 2021. Debate adjourned. Ms. Phillips speaking.
Honourable members, we are on second reading of Bill 77, and the member who caught my eye to join debate is the Honourable Member for Calgary Mountain View.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I am pleased to rise and speak to Bill 77, Municipal Government Restoring Tax Accountability Amendment Act. I will begin by indicating that it is my intention to move an amendment. Nice. I'll just wait for that. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So just as it comes up there, I move that the motion for second reading of Bill 77, Municipal Government Restoring Tax Accountability Amendment Act 2021, be amended by deleting all the words after that and substituting the following: Bill 77, Municipal Government Restoring Tax Accountability Amendment Act 2021, be not now read a second time, but that the subject matter of this bill be referred to the Standing Committee on Resource Stewardship in accordance with Standing Order 74.2.
The Honourable Member, as is normally the case, there will be copies of the amendment placed at each table close to the entrances there. You can also put up your hand if you would like a copy of it. For the purposes of debate, this will be referred to as REF1. If the Honourable Member for Calgary Mountain View could please continue with 1350 remaining.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. So what the amendment is intended to do is to refer the subject matter of this bill to a standing committee for further consideration. And so the issue the bill is intended to address is unpaid municipal taxes by industry. And this is an issue which has been growing, admittedly, over the past number of years. And so, you know, this bill is coming forward, but it's coming forward rather too late to address the problem it intends to address. So, you know, due to the delay in introducing the bill, it may now be impossible for many of these municipalities to recoup the taxes because the companies have become what in the legal field they sometimes refer to as judgment proof, which is to say insolvent. So you can't collect against them even if you have a legal right to collect against them because, well, you can't get something from nothing, I suppose. So certainly this is a concern. It's definitely a concern for municipalities. This bill probably should have been introduced sooner, but it was not. And so I think sort of further conversations need to be had around this, among other reasons, because this is sort of part of a larger problem, if you will. So, you know, I know the government is going to stand up and say, we need to do this now, it's absolutely essential. Well, actually, we needed to do it 2 years ago. But anyway, so now they introduced this legislation which returns to an ineffective approach from the past while putting the burden of cost and enforcement on the municipalities. So I think the concern here is that, you know, there was a way to do it, that way was removed, now we've kind of gone back to the way it was in the past, we've done it too late. So there are a lot of concerns with this bill, a lot of concerns that are worth talking through. And then the administration and implementation costs for these municipalities to recoup the lost tax revenues may ultimately not be worth the cost. And this, I mean, this happens in all sectors, in all areas, right? it's often the case that if someone has sort of quote unquote, like done you wrong, I guess in a legal sense, that even though you may have a right to recoup the money, it may not be worth recouping the money because the sort of cost of doing so is exorbitant relative to the amount of money you would get back. So, I mean, adding the ability to levy special liens on companies is a strategy. Municipal leaders have been asking for tools in addition to this. So this is one of the reasons we think we should be having this conversation because, again, this sort of takes us back to a tool that previously existed, but people asked for other tools, and those other tools are not contained in this bill. One of the things I think that municipal leaders have raised is calling for the AER to prohibit issuing of licenses to bad actors if they don't pay their taxes, which is reasonable. It's not in this legislation, nor has it been referenced to the best of my knowledge. So, once again, it's sort of a matter of people have asked for something from this government. They've acted rather later than they ought to have, and they haven't done nearly as much as they ought to have. And this is a theme. I think it's sort of a consistent theme that we see with this government. They have to be sort of dragged to do the absolute minimum. We saw it actually just today with childcare agreements. Parents have spent lots of money that they could have had in their pockets that they probably could have used. This is a challenging time for many. And this government just delayed and delayed and delayed and delayed and delayed, and then they finally did the thing under much pressure from the public. Now, we think they're going to do the same with respect to coal mining in the Eastern Slopes, but we still haven't found out because even though today was supposed to be the day, Mr. Speaker, that we finally got the report back.
Honourable members, a point of order has been called.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Under 23B, 1, 2, and 3, it speaks to matters other than the question under discussion. The honourable member just talked about childcare, a completely separate issue. She just finished talking about another bill that we were discussing. And all this is great, Mr. Speaker. The role and the responsibilities of the opposition are to oppose. But unfortunately for the Speaker, who was doing an amazing job, just for the record, their job is also to talk about the bill before the House. And it turns out she was talking about two other issues that are not before the House. So I would ask you to respectfully, Mr. Speaker, to direct the member to talk about the bill that's before the House instead of take a walk down a whole bunch of random pathways that are not before the House at this particular time.
I see the honourable member for Edmonton Northwest has risen to respond.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And certainly, I think you'll agree that the line of argument the honourable member from Calgary Mountain View was following was what is known as comparing and looking for reference and looking for a pattern of behavior. And so, to the honourable member who did bring up this point of order, just as perhaps as a teaching moment for him to realize that, of course, you are looking at a way by which you can look at the reference and the way by which this government is approaching its job. And I can tell you that with the general public, with this official opposition, on so many issues, they are simply approaching it in the very worst and wrong and incorrect way. So it's not a point of order. Thank you very much.
I appreciate the arguments put forward by both sides of this House with regards to this. I do not find that it is a point of order. I would ask that the honourable member continue. We are on REF 1, and the honourable member for Calgary Mountain View can continue.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I appreciate the point raised by my honourable colleague. I do not think it is maybe the first time in this place that someone has referenced a bill which illustrates a pattern of behavior by a group of people, in this case the government, and how that pattern of behavior may have been repeated elsewhere. And I think, again, the concern with this is exactly the same as the concern with those two issues that I raised. I appreciate that the government may be sensitive about delaying the report back of the Cole panel once again in light of Albertans' stringent objections to their actions in that regard. I would be embarrassed too. But, Mr. Speaker, I think with respect to this bill, we're seeing, again, the same thing. You know, the government delays for 2 years. For 2 years, people have been asking for tools. And then they come back and provide them with a tool that existed before that people felt was insufficient. So, I mean, it's not nothing. It's a step in the right direction. I don't object on principle to giving municipalities this tool. It seems like if you have a problem and you take 2 years to address the problem, maybe you could come up with something new or an explanation for why the new things that other people have been proposed are not in here. It feels like to me, you know, if you're given an assignment and you take 2 years to sort of answer the call, that you should probably be able to come up with just a little bit more than, you know, the thing that existed before and people felt was inadequate then. Or at minimum, if there's nothing better, perhaps there's nothing better in the entire universe. I sincerely doubt that, but maybe that's the position the government is taking, and that's why they've done it this way. If there is nothing more, then some sort of an explanation for why the tools and requests that have come from municipal leaders have not been allowed. Because I think that that's reasonable, you know? I think that if people have come forward and said, like, here's this problem, and I'm not just coming to you with a problem, I'm coming to you with a suggestion for a solution. You know, like the solution that has been suggested. And again, I'm not claiming to have any special insider knowledge here. I don't know what the sort of full scope of consequences of allowing the AER to sort of decline to provide a license to a company that has sort of failed to pay their taxes. Whether that's the best policy solution. But what I do know is it's a policy solution that has been suggested and raised, and therefore I think that this government owes those individuals an answer as to why that wasn't the action taken. And I mean, that certainly probably isn't the only idea that has been raised. You know, there are municipal leaders across this province who are very well informed, very well versed in what their area of subject matter expertise is. And I suspect they have raised many things with the minister. And I think it's not unreasonable to ask of this government for some sort of explanation as to why, you know, 2 years into examining the problem, they were only able to come up with a historical tool that everyone has said has a series of problems. So, you know, it's my understanding that currently there is upwards of $200 million in outstanding unpaid taxes. So I would be interested to know whether the government can provide us with an estimate of how much this would fix. So, you know, of the existing problem, how much would this fix? And how many of those companies have already long since gone under? Because, I mean, for all we know, this tool may address less than 50% of the problem. It may be, you know, more than half that nobody's able to recoup from. And this sort of challenge reoccurs in a lot of places, right? Once an entity has gone under, there is no one to sort of pay for their liability. We see that with orphan wells, which is a problem that is growing and was incredibly difficult to solve, admittedly incredibly difficult to solve when the price of oil was low. Now that the price of oil is high, we don't see the government taking steps to address that at all, and I think that that is potentially a concern because we don't know. We don't know whether this is the last boom or not. We don't know precisely what the international price of oil will do. And the government of Alberta doesn't really have that many policy levers to control that international price of oil, despite the Minister of Energy's sort of self-congratulatory behavior with respect to those international forces. So I think the concern here is that we have a situation where municipalities are increasingly squeezed. The government has come in to address this one thing with this one tool, but they're doing nothing to address the massive costs, the massive cuts they've made to MSI. They're doing nothing to address the massive downloading that they've done of police costing onto many of these municipalities. So, you know, this government was elected claiming, you know, we're going to put more and more boots on the ground of RCMP, but they didn't pay for a single one of those boots. They came forward and forced municipalities, and incidentally, Mr. Speaker, it's worth noting, municipalities had this power. If they wanted to add additional RCMP officers to their jurisdiction, they could come forward and agree to pay that cost with the federal government and have as many additional officers as they wanted. But municipalities having that ability wasn't good enough for this government. So it sort of forced those additional costs onto the government, and then it took a victory lap on money that it was taking from municipalities, which I think is, a bit of a huge concern. In addition, I don't know that we have actually seen more boots on the ground. I certainly haven't heard from anyone that that's the case. I mean, maybe it's because at the same time they're trying to get this massive influx of RCMP officers. They're also threatening their jobs. They're also saying, come to Alberta where you may not be employed next year. So I think I don't know, what's happening to that money, Mr. Speaker? I'd be very interested. I would be very interested to know what happens to that money that the government is collecting from the municipalities. And those municipalities, I mean, they don't have their own money, right? They get it from the taxpayers. So it's money that this government is collecting from Albertans. If they can't provide those boots on the ground, what are they doing with the money? That's a question I'd like to know the answer to. I bet it's a question that taxpayers and municipal leaders would also like to know the answer to. I would love to be surprised and get an answer to that question, Mr. Speaker, but I will not hold my breath. So I think this is an attempt by this government to say,
Thank you, Honourable Member. We are on REF 1 for Bill 77, Municipal Government Restoring Tax Accountability Amendment Act 2021, and I see the Honourable Minister of Municipal Affairs has risen.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. How much time do I have here, if you don't mind? Pardon?
15.
15, okay, thank you.
Unless there's some interventions where we could potentially add another couple.
Thank you.
Of course.
So, Mr. Speaker, let me just say there's quite a bit to unpack there with the interesting diatribe that we just heard. One of the good questions near the end of it was, what are they doing with the money? Well, Mr. Speaker, it's an interesting question to ask, but what's always true, no matter who's in government, is that if you want to know what an Alberta government did with the money, you look at the audited financial reports from the year before, because it's kind of the law that every penny has to be accounted for. Now, what can be different is whether you agree with how the money was spent or not. And that member really opened up a hole that was pretty big, because I can tell you, when the folks across the way were in government, there was lots of big questions about what they were doing with the money. Oh, there was little stuff like paying somebody from Ontario to go change light bulbs in somebody's house or a shower head. There was stuff like not spending the money to defend the KXL pipeline, which could be responsible for tens or 20 or 100,000 jobs in Alberta. There could have been spending the money to fly the then Premier, now the Leader of the Opposition, down to Ottawa to pose for a picture while the Prime Minister, and smile while he canceled a pipeline that was severely important to Alberta's future and could have created literally hundreds of thousands of jobs. And the then Premier, now Leader of the Opposition, stood there and smiled and said, yeah, I'm really happy about this, because they're killing a pipeline that's going to take away jobs from the people I'm responsible for. But the honourable member across the way opened that door, so I just thought I would walk through that door for a couple minutes, because that's kind of important for people to remember what would happen if the folks across the aisle were ever over here, because I do remember when they were here, and they cost this province 180,000 plus jobs, 60, 70 billion dollars worth of investment that didn't just leave Alberta. It didn't just leave Alberta, it went to other places in the world that produce oil in an environmentally less responsible way than we do here in Alberta, and they drove that money out through their policies and through their bad treatment and through their disrespect for the men and women that work in this province. So that is a fact. So I guess if there's somebody here who should be just a little bit sensitive about this, it's the folks across the aisle. Now, Mr. Speaker, the member did say a couple things I agree with, and I'll quote, said she has no insider knowledge. Well, I think that was pretty obvious from the speech we just heard. And also said, I don't know, which is also pretty obvious from the speech we just heard. Said that at least twice during both those things at least twice. So I'm just repeating what the honourable member said a couple of times. So, Mr. Speaker, the interesting thing here is that the folks over there want to send this off to committee. And there are times when it's the right thing to send a bill or something that comes before this House off to committee, but not this time. See, Mr. Speaker, what they don't seem to, and you know what, they have access to all the media releases. I know they have a crack team of Twitter researchers over there, but even this stuff even makes it to Twitter. That when we released this legislation and our intention to bring it forward, the good folks from the rural municipalities of Alberta actually thought it was a good idea and said so publicly. So suddenly they're trying to take the position that the municipalities haven't been listened to. And I can assure you, Mr. Speaker, that they have been listened to. The RMA did a report a few months ago saying at that point, I think there was $245 million worth of unpaid property tax owed by oil and gas companies. And that number will be different today because obviously since those few months ago, there's been payments made and there's been additional taxes probably accrued that haven't been paid. But they told me, Mr. Speaker, on several occasions when I met with them, both online through a Zoom call or something like that, or face-to-face, that this was their number one issue, was unpaid property taxes from oil and gas companies. And, Mr. Speaker, I believe them. They're smart, they're good at what they do, and this legislation comes as a result of listening to them. And they know, Mr. Speaker, because they told me, which is why I know that, is that they cannot be sure how much of that money still owing this is going to help them to collect. But here's what I know. And the honourable member actually said a couple things, that some of those companies may go out of business, and that's true. And that's also the reason why this amendment is so tone deaf and so negative and so bad for rural municipalities in this province. Because the more months you let go by before we give them this tool to collect the oil and gas property taxes that are unpaid, the more months you've got for companies to go under and become insolvent and have nothing to get to pay to those municipalities. But they don't get it over there. They're just it occurs to me that they are so anxious to put oil and gas companies out of business. They actually don't care about who gets the money that those oil and gas companies owe, including the municipalities.
Mr. Speaker, it's so incredibly obvious. Now, if I was a spiteful person, and I'm not, and if I didn't care about municipalities, and I do, oh, that would make me like somebody that would bring this amendment forward, because the result of their amendment probably will be more oil and gas companies will go out of business before they pay the taxes owed to the municipalities. So this thing that they bring forward to spite municipalities actually makes it less possible for them to collect the taxes owed. Now, something else that the honourable member said 2 or 3 times, and I probably won't get the words exactly right, but suggested that this method of collecting taxes didn't work. That's actually not what the municipality said. They actually asked for this method of collecting the taxes back. And the folks across the aisle, if they've done their homework, ought to know this, but I'll walk down memory lane a little bit because this is actually pertinent to this piece of legislation and pertinent to the amendment that the opposition put on the floor. The fact is, in 2019, there was a decision in the courts called the Virginia Hills decision, where somebody fought their ability to pay their an oil and gas company fought their need to pay their property taxes to a municipality, and the courts of this great province ruled in their favor. Now, the courts of this great province did not say that a special levy was illegal. They didn't say that even that it was a bad idea. They just said the special levy that was in place was not specific enough. That's what the court said. So the municipalities, one of the things they said is, why don't you put the special levy back in place and make it more specific so we can collect the taxes like we used to before the special levy went away. It wasn't, as the honourable member said, that it wasn't working. Quite the opposite. It was working just fine. And when the special levy went away, that's when the unpaid oil and gas taxes went through the roof, which is a pretty good indication it was exactly what was working, which is exactly why we're bringing it back, because it works. So, Mr. Speaker, listen, there's no guarantee we got this right, but I can tell you we put a lot of effort into this. And people in the administration smarter than me looked at it and said, how can we put the special levy back in place and make it more specific so that it's consistent with what the court said we had to do? Again, they didn't say a special levy was a bad idea. They said a special levy that wasn't very specific was a bad idea. So this, if we got it right, and I sincerely hope we do, and I believe we do because people smarter than me did the legal work on this, we put a special levy, this is to put a special levy back in place that is very much more specific about what municipalities can put a levy on and what they cannot put a levy on in order to collect their property taxes. And in fact, it puts them, there's another court case, the Redwater case, that puts environmental recoveries through the court at the top of the collection list for everybody, regardless of everything else. But this actually puts, and the government was first before then until Redwater, now the environmental issues to collect from a company is at the top. The government of Alberta is next, or the governments in general, or Alberta and Canada, and after that will be the municipalities through the special levy. And when they're that high up on the list, then that will make them able to collect property taxes from oil and gas companies that owe those property taxes like they used to. And when that right went away through the court decision, that's when the property taxes owed built up to, and were unpaid, built up to the almost $250 million level. And this is what municipalities asked for. Now, I guess over there they could say, well, you could have done other things. Sure, you could have done 1,000 other things. But it was a proven, not unproven as the other side said, but actually a proven method that municipalities used for years to collect their property taxes. Not only that, it's pretty consistent with what the oil and gas companies actually applied for their wells with a set of rules that included the municipality's ability to collect through the special levy. So it's actually not even unfair to the oil and gas companies. And both CAP and EPAC said publicly when we brought out this legislation that they agree with it. They think it's a reasonable way to get back to what is normal. So here we are. We got a way for municipalities to collect the money that they are owed, that they desperately need, that they want, that they ask for, and then we listen to them, not once, but several times. And we're trying to give municipalities what they ask for, and the opposition says, oh no, don't do what municipalities want. I want you to send it off to committee. While meanwhile, we don't know how many other oil and gas companies will go under and will have no money to pay, and the municipalities will never be able to recover. I guess, as I said earlier, if I was a vindictive person, I'd wish they'd win this amendment, because actually, at this point, even the fact they tried to make this amendment tells me that rural municipalities should never vote for anybody running under the NDP banner, because they obviously don't care about the municipalities being able to collect the taxes that they're owed. And yet, they stood up in this House and made that amendment. How embarrassing. How out of touch. How tone deaf. How insensitive to the needs of rural municipalities in Alberta could the NDP be to make this amendment? No, Mr. Speaker, I will not be supporting this amendment. I will recommend respectfully to my colleagues on the government side not to support this amendment. In fact, I'll respectfully appeal to anybody that is thinking anywhere else that's not on this side of the House to vote against this amendment, because this is clearly an attack on Alberta's rural municipalities. Full stop. And I won't be supporting it.
Here. Thank you, Honourable Minister. I see the Honourable Member for Calgary-McCall has risen to join debate.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. That was interesting to watch. Virginia Hill decision that Minister referred was handed down by the Court of Appeal in February of 2019. They became government on March 30th, April 30th. No. The government, I think it was end of April or May. And then for all those months, they didn't do anything. In 2019, they didn't do anything. They were busy attacking municipalities in other ways. In 2020, they didn't do anything. They were busy cutting municipal sustainability initiative, offloading policing costs onto municipalities, and hurting them in every possible way. And now, at the end of 2021, after almost 30 months, they are taking some action and not even willing to listen to the feedback that what Albertans have to say about this, what municipalities have to say about this piece of legislation. And Minister spends 15 minutes without saying one single useful thing, that who he has talked to, who he has consulted, what he has done about the concerns. Like, I have heard representatives from the municipalities that they want this government to use AER process to stop those bad actors who owe taxes from getting new licenses. Minister has not responded that why he didn't choose that route. These taxes, that's municipalities' money. Municipalities are owed these taxes. If after 30 months, government decided to do something, a half-baked solution, I think they should have worked with the municipalities. They could have made sure that the process they are putting in place will ensure that municipalities are able to collect on those unpaid taxes. They are owed that taxes. And now that it has reached crisis situation, the government is doing exactly what they have been doing on other files. Act last and do least. That has been their policy ever since they became government. And because of this delay, it is now impossible for many municipalities to recoup those taxes owed to them because some of those companies are not there anymore. And this legislation in no way, shape, or manner helps them. Had this government not waited for 30 months for this situation to reach a crisis point, some of those municipalities may have been able to recover some of those taxes owing to them. Municipalities have been asking this government to take action on it. They didn't. And I think that municipalities have suggested some other ways as well. But here, Minister thinks he knows the best, and that's why he has come up with this legislation, which may or may not work for many municipalities. As I said, the municipal leaders are calling for the Alberta Energy Regulator, calling for the process through Alberta Energy Regulator, that if companies are owing taxes to municipalities, that they shouldn't be issued further licenses. The minister didn't address any of those concerns. And somehow, then, not even willing to refer this bill to a committee to listen to those concerns, to explore those concerns. It's a lot of money for these municipalities that's at stake here. We must get it right and give municipalities every tool so they can collect on these unpaid taxes. I will give it.
Well, thank you. I appreciate the honourable member giving me a minute. And, we have a very unique opportunity here to talk about this very bill in the next few days, because, of course, we have the AUMA and then the subsequent week, the RMA. I just wanted to know if the honourable member was planning to attend, and, will we be canvassing this bill at those two events, and is that a useful use of time and our time that we're holding this bill now, so that we can take it to those two places to see if it holds up and stands the test of hundreds of scrutineering eyes that need the money to run their municipalities.
Thank you, my colleague, for that important question. Certainly, I will be attending, and municipal leader from across the province will be gathering there, and I will be engaging in conversations on this particular issue and on all issues that matter to them. I have reached out to some of the new council colleagues in Calgary as well, and those who got elected elsewhere. I think they have many things that they want this government to listen to. Minister was earlier talking about tone deaf. I think when you hear the concerns and hear the response of this government that municipal leaders are getting, that kind of fits the definition of tone deaf. Like in Calgary, for instance, like they have cut funding from municipal sustainability initiative, they have cut funding from their policing grants, they have taken more revenues from tickets, they have taken more revenues from cannabis sale. I think municipalities are really suffering under this government because this government is completely tone deaf to their concerns. And they didn't get the support they needed during this pandemic. Even in the pandemic, the government will act last and do the least so they can get an announcement and some photo op out of it. That's all they have done. They have not listened or worked with the municipal leaders on the ground, dealing with the problem of these unpaid taxes every single day. And because of this delay of this UCP government, now that amount has grown over $200 million. And had government acted early on during their mandate, this problem will not get to this crisis situation. And now that they decided to do something, they are still refusing to listen to this side of the House. They are refusing to listen to Albertans, municipal leaders, and new leadership that has emerged as a result of October 18 election. They have not done the homework. And that is the why we're asking that this bill be referred to the committee and we explore other solutions put forward by the municipalities, such as using AER to help them collect these taxes, and any other proposal and solution that may come from the municipal leaders who got elected recently on October 18. There will be an opportunity to get it right, and I think we can get it done quickly as well. It doesn't have to wait another 30 months like government waited to bring this bill forward. So with that, I will urge all members of the legislature to support this very common sense and needed and necessary referral motion. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Honourable Member. The Honourable Member who caught my eye now is the Honourable Member for Lac St. Anne Parkland.
Oh, thank you, Mr. Speaker. We've had some very fulsome debate going back and forth. The minister that brought forward this bill is he's not a newbie. I don't know how else to say it. He's one of those seasoned veterans that's been around for a while, been there, done that, specifically on that municipal file. And I have a ton of respect for the minister. I know I'm not supposed to say that I don't have as much respect for the members opposite, because that may be on a borderline, but as far as their experience, I have a lot more respect for the members on this aisle, given the file that we're talking about. Still, I'm struggling sometimes, and I still see myself as kind of a rookie in here. But I think I've been around for 2 years now and kind of understand a stall tactic when I see one. Now, the problem that I struggle with, though, is on these stall tactics, and there's one of the things that you'll see that opposition parties will do. What they'll do is they'll try to kick things back to committee. Now, that's a fancy way of dragging out something that's pretty decent typically, or if they completely disagree for ideological reasons or whatever Twitter feed points they need to make or anything else, then they might do that. But if there was something that was really serious, I could maybe get on side of that. And one of the things that was given to me is newly elected person, first parade I ever did was this one gentleman. He says, make sure when you get in there, if there are good ideas, that you guys talk about them. And he had pointed out what Premier Lougheed had done before he was actually the Premier. He says what caught his eye is when the other items were being brought up, that they gave way to it. They actually considered it. So they would talk about the items and say, well, you know, maybe we can offer some improvement. Mr. Speaker, I haven't heard one lick of improvement being offered here. All I've heard is that we need to consult more. Now, we've already had a lot of latitude talking about a pattern of behavior. That seems to be the opposition's favorite pattern. Stall it out even when they weren't the opposition. Drag things out, the active non-participation, if you would, by being here. There's so many files that I could start to get into, but the energy file? Seriously? We're talking, so just so folks understand at home, this is Bill 77, the Municipal Government Restoring Tax Accountability Amendment Act. So what that means, loosely translated, let's put a bill in place that allows the municipalities, predominantly rural municipalities, to collect the taxes that are owed to them by some of the delinquent oil and gas sector that we have. Now, the interesting thing about the oil and gas sectors, they took a hit. Now, the opposition would have you believe that this was something that was completely out of their control and out of their wheelhouse. I've heard them pontificate, wondering why there's so many people leaving the province. They're going to other jurisdictions where this is still supported. We're sitting in a country where our own Prime Minister is basically trying to put us on the death knells. And to some of the comments earlier, they're ready to stand up and take photo ops with them. So on one hand, they'll make you believe that they're really, really for the energy sector, but they're up to the same old tricks, the same stuff. This is literally a chance for municipalities to get the back taxes that they needed. The decent energy players have already been given a reprieve. This is to clean up both sides of the equation. And you know what happened, Mr. Speaker? When we had, and I would argue to say it wasn't the best thing, I kind of put it as, when we first came out about this, talking about the linear assessment, you would have heard the other side going nonstop about how we messed that up. And here's how I kind of put it to our own minister at the time. I said, you know, it's kind of one of those things. It's like you took a bag of cats, shook them all out, and threw them on the table, and we all had to figure it out. It was kind of a bad deal. This is not. This is through consultation of that process that we talked about the energy sector, the oil and gas companies, and the municipalities. Came up with something that was middle road that everybody could work with, meaning that you can keep those companies still in business, still paying their taxes, still paying for the things that we need in rural. But instead, what we're going to do, because we're on an amendment right now, so I guess I got to speak to the amendment, instead of speaking to the actual bill that we should be putting back in the House so we can get taxes paid, make sure that we have a sustainable industry, and keep the lights on. Now, to hear the NDP talking about how they stand up for rural, wow. You want to come into my backyard and talk about how that's your main concern and how you understand it better than anybody else. I don't know. I seem to remember this Bill 6 thing. I seem to remember tractors rolling up the driveway out here in the ledge. And if anyone hasn't been here, you roll a four-wheel drive John Deere up there. She's a little snug in the corners. So the folks that actually came out here and said, yeah, you're really listening to us? Not a chance. Not a chance. Bill 77. Allows municipalities to collect those unpaid property taxes. Vast majority of oil and gas is on side with this, and that they do pay their taxes. And there's some delinquent ones. Members opposite are heckling, and it's good, because I'm giving them the gears. At least maybe this one won't come out in CBC. They'll actually listen to what the debate is here, so this is good. Yeah. In February, rural municipalities surveyed 69 members and found that 245 million unpaid property taxes owing from oil and gas companies. Yeah, it's on the books. This is going to help facilitate both sides to get that back in the coffers. So why would we delay it anymore? Because we need more people. And I'm not going to give away this time. Normally I would, but this one I'm on a good roll right now. I'm going to let her rip. That was 42% increase from the year over, the previous year. Half of this is unpaid by Alberta companies currently operating, while their half is facing insolvency. We need to facilitate something. So back again to the minister's point. If he wanted to go through with this, and if he was really facetious, he would allow this to fail. We don't want that. We want our country to thrive. We want our province to thrive. And if we can put in some common sense legislation that helps facilitate that, to keep the lights on at home in those rural municipalities, these aren't just foreign companies that work in these areas. They're the friends and neighbors and relatives right down the road. This is the sustainability. We're talking about keeping rural sustainable. This is part of it. Bill 77 helps municipalities by restoring special lien to give municipalities priority over creditors to receive taxes owed. In addition, the government would help municipalities avoid significant losses right now by extending the provincial education requisition credit program throughout 2023-24. Oh, so it's also going to help pay for the education. Yeah, we better go to committee on that one and put it back and debate it and bring in how many more people. And you want to hear one of the main pillars, we're jumping up and down for education, but we don't know how we're paying for it. So it's one of those things we need to do. This could put some strain on the oil and gas companies that are already having a tough time finding creditors. That's why this government is providing a 35% cost reduction in property taxes for the shallow gas wells and associated pipelines in 2019, estimated the well drilling equipment tax, and provided a tax holiday for those new wells and associated pipelines till 2024. So pretty common sense again from both sides, Mr. Speaker. So for the life of me, I don't understand why that we want to push against this. I don't understand why we have to keep dragging it back to committee. And I don't understand why it's a stall tactic. Why is it a stall tactic to do something like this? So for the love of Pete, and anybody else out there with a similar name, please let's get back to the main bill. Let's stop the posturing here and let's just get going. And with that, I would like to close debate. Adjourn debate.
Good job. All those in favor with the motion as proposed by the Honourable Member for Lac St. Anne Parkland to adjourn debate. All those in favor, please say aye. Any opposed, please say no. No. I believe the ayes have it. That is carried and so ordered.
Are you doing division?
I see the Honourable Deputy Government House Leader has risen.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's an honor to rise, but at this time, after a long day of work, I move that we adjourn the Assembly until 10 a.m. Thursday, November 16th, 2021.
Okay.
Good catch. I've made two mistakes today. Tuesday, tomorrow morning. I move that we adjourn the Assembly to Tuesday, tomorrow morning, 10 a.m. Thank you. No, good catch.
Just for clarity,
I did see the date right though. The date was correct though.
All those members in favor with the motion as proposed by the Honourable Deputy Government House Leader to come back here at 10 a.m. tomorrow. All those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Any opposed, please say no. That is carried and so ordered. We are adjourned.